The night was cold, and the wind had a sharpness to it, making the leaves rustle in an eerie way. I had always enjoyed camping, but something about this trip felt different. Maybe it was the isolation of the campsite, far from the usual crowd, or the fact that I had come alone this time. But as I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest around me seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional distant call of a bird or animal. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself it was just my imagination, but it lingered. I had set up my tent earlier that afternoon, a simple two-person tent that I had used many times before. My gear was scattered around the site: sleeping bag, backpack, a few cans of food. Everything seemed fine, but the longer I sat there, the more I became aware of the silence around me. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence either. It was thick and heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something. I glanced at the trees, their branches swaying in the wind. The shadows they cast were long and twisting, stretching across the forest floor like dark fingers. I couldn't help but imagine what could be lurking in those shadows, even though I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Still, the feeling of unease gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. As the fire burned low, I decided to get into my tent. The wind had picked up, and the night felt even colder now. I zipped up the tent and settled into my sleeping bag, trying to shake the uncomfortable feeling. The sounds of the forest continued, but it felt like they were getting closer, like the trees were whispering secrets just out of reach. I tried to sleep, but it wasn't easy. The sound of the wind howling through the trees kept me awake, along with the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Every now and then, I would hear something that sounded like footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps, but when I checked, there was nothing there. My nerves were starting to fray, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or some other animal. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside, and the sunlight had already begun to filter through the trees. I felt relieved, like the worst of the night had passed. I decided to take a walk through the woods, stretch my legs a bit, and clear my head. I packed a small snack and a bottle of water into my backpack, strapped it on, and left the campsite. The trail was narrow, winding through thick trees and underbrush. The forest here was dense, and I could barely see the sky through the canopy of leaves above. I walked for a while, enjoying the solitude. It was peaceful, and the quiet of the forest seemed almost comforting in the daylight. But the further I walked, the more something felt off again. It wasn't like the previous night. There was no immediate danger, no clear threat. It was just a feeling, a sense that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was nearby, watching me from the shadows. I paused several times, turning to look behind me, but saw nothing, just the trees, the rocks, and the underbrush. I continued on, trying to ignore the feeling, until I came across something odd. It was a small clearing, not much bigger than a few yards across, and in the center of it was a pile of rocks. It looked like it had been carefully arranged, not like a natural formation. The rocks were stacked in a way that felt intentional, almost as if they were marking something. I stepped closer, curiosity getting the better of me. As I crouched down to inspect the pile, I noticed something strange. Tucked between two of the rocks was a small piece of cloth, frayed at the edges. I picked it up, and it felt odd, almost like fabric that had been weathered by time. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned it over in my hands, and that's when I saw it. Something carved into the rock beneath the cloth. It was faint, but it looked like a symbol, a sort of jagged pattern that didn't seem like anything I recognized. It wasn't like any typical trail marker, and it certainly wasn't a natural shape. It almost looked like a warning. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt the unease grow in the pit of my stomach. I stood up quickly, brushing off the feeling that had crept up on me. I was starting to feel like maybe it was time to leave, but curiosity pushed me to keep exploring. After all, I had come out here to get away from everything, to clear my mind, not to turn back just because of a strange symbol. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around, scanning the trees, but everything was still. The wind had died down, and the forest was eerily quiet again. I shrugged it off and made my way back toward the trail, but the sense of unease didn't leave me. I reached my campsite by midday, and for the first time in a long while, I felt grateful for the sight of my tent and fire pit. I set down my pack and sat down, trying to push away the feeling of being followed. I glanced around nervously, wondering if I was just imagining things. I had no reason to believe I was in danger, but my instincts told me something wasn't right. I spent the afternoon keeping busy, gathering firewood, checking my gear, and even preparing some food. But as the evening approached and the sun began to dip behind the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was closing in around me. It was like the trees had grown taller and the shadows deeper. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Night fell and I lit the fire again. The crackling flames provided some comfort, but I was still uneasy. I sat there for a while, staring into the fire, listening to the wind, trying to ignore the odd noises that seemed to surround me. It was probably just animals moving through the underbrush, I told myself. There was no need to worry. But then I heard something else, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but as it grew louder, I realized it wasn't a whisper at all. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone walking around the campsite. I froze, staring into the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps weren't like animal tracks. They were too heavy, too purposeful. I jumped to my feet, scanning the area, but there was nothing. No person, no animal, just the shadows and the trees. The wind howled again, but the footsteps, those slow, heavy steps, continued. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, my hands shaking. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. No one was there. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe there was someone out there. But something in the pit of my stomach told me that whatever it wasn't friendly. I backed away from the fire, moving closer to my tent, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. I stayed there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening, and hoping whatever it was would leave. Finally, the footsteps stopped. The forest went silent again, and the air seemed to shift. The tension lifted, and I allowed myself to relax just a little. Maybe I was overthinking everything. Maybe I just needed a good night's sleep. But as I crawled into my tent, I kept the flashlight on and the zipper halfway open, just in case. I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to calm my racing heart, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. The wind had died down again, and the world outside was quiet. My eyes drifted shut, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still out there. The night passed without incident, and when I woke up in the morning, the campsite was still. There was no sign of anyone or anything strange. I packed up quickly, not wanting to stay in the area any longer. I didn't know if it had been a trick of the mind or if something had really been out there, but either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. As I walked back down the trail to the parking lot, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The woods had their mysteries, but some things were better left unexplored. When I reached my car and drove away, I looked back one last time at the forest, the place where I had felt so uneasy. But I had survived the night, and that was enough for me. I promised myself I would come back, just not alone. The next day, when I got home, I went through my gear, checking for anything I might have missed. It was then that I found something strange. A small stone in the pocket of my jacket. It was smooth, round, and cold to the touch. I had no idea how it had gotten there, but as I held it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with the strange events of the night before. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me wonder if I had really been alone in those woods after all. I had been working from home for over 2 years straight, staring at screens day and night. My head felt heavy all the time, and I was tired of the noise from traffic outside my apartment in the city. One night, after another long shift, I finally decided I needed a real break. No screens, no emails, just a place where I could breathe again. I started searching for isolated cabins online, and after scrolling for hours, I found one deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It wasn't part of any resort or managed campground, just an old wooden cabin sitting by itself on private land, owned by an old man who barely used it anymore. The photos looked rough but livable, and that's exactly what I wanted. Somewhere quiet and real. I packed my car with enough supplies for a full week. Non-perishable food, water jugs, a first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, a portable stove, clothes, boots, and a few basic tools in case anything broke. I also brought my sleeping bag and a thick wool blanket. The cabin had no electricity, no cell service, and no running water. That made it perfect. The drive took about 8 hours from the city. The last 30 miles were rough, dirt roads full of potholes, tall trees on either side, and no sign of another human anywhere. The GPS cut out about 20 minutes before I reached the cabin. I had to rely on printed directions I'd written down before I left. When I finally arrived, it was late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip behind the tree line, and the air had that crisp bite that told me night was coming fast. The cabin looked like something from another time. The wood was dark from years of weather, the roof slightly sagging on one side. There was a small porch with 2 broken chairs and a crate that looked like it had been used as a table. I stepped inside and was hit with the musty smell of wood, dust, and something a little sour, maybe from a mouse that had died somewhere inside. The single room was small but enough. There was an old iron stove in the corner, a wooden table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a bed frame with a thin, sagging mattress. I opened the windows to air it out and started unpacking. The first night was calm. I boiled water on my portable stove, made some instant noodles, and sat outside in the growing darkness. I hadn't heard another voice in hours, just the occasional rustle of wind through trees or the sound of something moving in the underbrush, probably deer or raccoons. I felt peaceful. That night, I slept in my sleeping bag on top of the mattress. I kept the flashlight by my side, more out of habit than fear. The next few days followed a quiet rhythm. I would wake up early, cook something simple, go on long hikes through the forest, and return before dark. I had no connection to the outside world, and it felt like I was slowly peeling off layers of noise from my mind. My thoughts became clearer. I wasn't thinking about work or emails anymore. Just the sound of my boots on leaves, the way the trees creaked, and the sharp smell of pine. But around the 4th day, something started to feel strange. It was small at first. I noticed some of my food containers had been moved. Not opened, just shifted slightly. I thought maybe I had done it without noticing, but I always put things back in the same spot. Then I found muddy prints near the back of the cabin. Too large for a dog, definitely not a deer. They were boot prints and they were fresh. I hadn't seen a single soul since I arrived. No cars, no hikers, no voices. I tried to shake it off, telling myself maybe they were old and I just hadn't noticed them earlier. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, hearing noises outside, sticks snapping, leaves crunching. I stayed still, holding my breath. Every time I turned on the flashlight and looked out the window, I saw nothing, just black trees. I told myself again it was probably just animals, maybe a bear, but bears didn't wear boots. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. I saw more boot prints, this time circling the backside. Some prints were deep, like someone had stood still for a long time. I checked all the doors and windows again. Everything was shut tight, but I couldn't stop thinking about how far I was from anyone. If someone was out here watching me, they could do whatever they wanted, and no one would know for days, maybe weeks. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed most of my things that day, keeping only what I needed for the night. I'd leave first thing in the morning, but just as the sun was going down, I heard something loud in the woods behind the cabin. Not just a branch breaking, this was different. A crashing sound, followed by silence. I stood frozen in the middle of the room. Then I heard it again, closer this time. It sounded like someone was running through the forest. I turned off the lantern, grabbed my flashlight and knife, and crouched near the window. I aimed the flashlight out the back window and clicked it on. Nothing but trees. I waited, heart thudding so hard I thought it might echo off the walls. Then something moved, just for a second. A flicker of movement behind a tree, far out in the darkness. I kept the light steady, but whatever it was didn't move again. I stayed there for hours, barely blinking. Around midnight, the sounds stopped. I locked the door, blocked it with the table, and sat in the corner, knife in hand, waiting for morning. At first light, I threw everything in my car and started driving. I didn't care about the speed. I just wanted to get away from the cabin. But about 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. On the dirt road behind me, I saw a figure standing perfectly still. A man, dressed in dark clothes, maybe wearing a hood. He wasn't walking, just standing there watching. I didn't stop to get a better look. I kept driving until I hit the main road, then kept going another 3 hours before I even considered stopping. When I finally got home, I didn't unpack for days. I left the bags in the corner of the room and just sat in silence. I thought about that figure in the woods, those boot prints, the noises at night. Someone had been watching me the whole time. They never approached directly. They just watched, waited. Maybe they were waiting for me to slip up. Maybe they just liked to scare people. I'll never know. I looked up the cabin again a few weeks later. The listing was gone. I tried contacting the man who owned it, but there was no reply. Eventually, I stopped looking, but I never forgot the way it felt to know I was being watched. The silence of the forest that wasn't really silent. The footprints that weren't mine. The figure in the mirror that didn't move. Now, when people tell me they want to get away from everything, to find peace in the middle of nowhere, I don't say much. But I always think about that cabin. How peace isn't always peaceful. How quiet isn't always safe. I still go hiking sometimes, but I never go alone, and I never go too far off the map. I had been trying to get away from everything for a while. Work, city noise, phone calls, people. Everything just felt heavy. I lived in a small apartment above a hardware store in Reno, and the constant hum of traffic outside my window had started getting to me. The walls were thin, and my neighbor's television was always too loud. I hadn't taken a real break in over a year, and I was getting tired of excuses. So when I finally got a full week off work, I packed up my old hiking backpack, double-checked my gear, and decided to head out solo into the Pine Forest Range in northwestern Nevada. I had done a few solo trips before, but nothing this isolated. That was the whole point this time. I didn't want to hear anyone or see anyone for days. I left early on a Tuesday morning in late September. The weather had started to cool down, but the forecast looked good, clear skies, highs in the mid-60s, lows around 40 at night, crisp but bearable. I drove west on I-80 and then turned off onto a series of rough gravel roads that led up toward Duffer Peak. The plan was to park near one of the old logging access roads, then hike about 8 miles into the woods where I knew there was a small clearing near a creek. No cell signal, no noise, no one. The trail wasn't official, just a faint path through the brush that I had mapped out using a combination of Google Earth and old topographic maps. I had it marked on my GPS watch and carried a paper map and compass just in case. I had a small tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a camp stove, food for 5 days, a water filter, and an emergency radio. It was basic but enough. The first day went smoothly. The air smelled clean. It was quiet, just the crunch of dry grass and pine needles under my boots and the occasional rustle of something small moving through the brush. I saw some deer tracks, a hawk gliding silently overhead, and heard the distant knocking of a woodpecker somewhere up the ridge. I found the clearing by the creek just before sunset. It was perfect. Flat ground, no signs of people, and a slow-moving stream about 20 yards away with cold, clear water. I pitched my tent under a group of tall pines and cooked some rice and beans on my camp stove as the sky turned a deep orange. That first night was peaceful. The stars came out, and I sat for a long time by the small fire I'd made, just listening to the water and the wind in the trees. I fell asleep fast. The next morning, I woke up feeling good. I made some instant coffee, ate a granola bar, and set out to explore a bit. I followed the creek upstream for about an hour, checking out the terrain and making mental notes in case I wanted to hike farther the next day. I found a spot where the water narrowed and picked up speed, bubbling over smooth stones. It was the kind of place you only see in forest postcards. On the way back to camp, I saw some fresh animal tracks, likely coyote or bobcat. I wasn't worried. I'd spent enough time outdoors to know they stayed away from people. Back at camp, I spent the afternoon reading, stretching out in the sun, boiling more water. Felt good to be that disconnected. No texts, no emails, no news, no people. Just the sound of the wind. But that night, something changed. Around 1 a.m, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. The forest was silent. My tent was zipped. I was warm, but something had pulled me out of sleep. I sat up and listened. It was completely still outside. Too still. No wind, no crickets, no rustling. Felt unnatural. I sat in the dark for maybe 5 minutes, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. Then I heard it. A soft, slow crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves, about 30 feet away. My heart jumped. I froze. It wasn't a deer. I knew the sound deer made, fast, skittish. This was slow and deliberate, like someone trying not to be heard. Then silence again. I stayed perfectly still, my hand gripping the small hatchet I kept next to my sleeping bag. Another crunch. Closer this time. I turned off my headlamp, even though it wasn't on, just in case the tiny red charging light could be seen through the fabric of the tent. I didn't move. 10 minutes passed. Maybe more. Then nothing. No more sounds. Eventually, I convinced myself it might have been an animal sniffing around and left. I tried to sleep, but I never really did. The next morning, I looked around the campsite. Nothing was disturbed. My food bag was still hanging in the tree. No tracks, no trash, no signs of anything. I tried to shake it off. It's easy to let your imagination get the best of you when you're out there alone. Still, I didn't hike far that day. I stayed close to camp, collected more water, checked the area again. The day was quiet. The woods looked the same, but that feeling didn't go away. That something was off, that I wasn't really alone. That night, I set up a few things around my camp. I tied a piece of fishing line to a couple of branches and ran it around the tent perimeter about knee-height. Nothing fancy, just something that might make a noise if anything or anyone walked through it. I also laid out a few sticks in a pattern near the entrance. If they got disturbed, I'd know. I stayed awake late by the fire that night. Every snap and pop from the flames made me twitch. The forest around me stayed quiet. Too quiet again. When I finally crawled into the tent, I kept the hatchet beside me and left my boots on, just in case. It happened again sometime after midnight. I didn't hear the same crunching sound this time. What woke me up was the fishing line. I heard it snap. A quick, high-pitched ting like a guitar string breaking. Then complete silence. I didn't breathe. I waited. Then I heard the softest sound, bare feet, I think, on soft ground. Slow, controlled, right outside the tent. I grabbed the hatchet and held it tight. My heart was hammering. I thought I heard breathing, not loud, but close. Then it stopped, just like that. I sat there for over an hour, unmoving. Eventually, the first light of dawn started to push through the trees. I waited until it was fully bright before unzipping the tent and stepping out. The sticks were scattered. The fishing line was snapped in one place and pulled to the side. There were faint impressions in the dirt, not full footprints, but enough to know something had been there. Something big and barefoot. I packed up everything fast. My hands were shaking. I didn't make breakfast. I didn't care about leaving trash. I stuffed everything into my bag and hiked out in a straight line, not even following the trail I had marked on the way in. I just wanted to put distance between me and that spot. After a few miles, I finally got a weak cell signal. I didn't call anyone. I just checked the map and saw I was about 2 hours from the highway if I kept my pace. I didn't stop. I didn't drink water. I just kept moving. I made it back to my car by early afternoon. Nothing looked touched. I climbed in and locked the doors. I sat there for 10 minutes, just breathing, trying to settle the nerves. Then I started the engine and drove straight back to Reno without stopping. When I got home, I dumped all my gear in a corner of the apartment and didn't look at it for weeks. I barely slept for days after that. Every small sound in the hallway or outside my window made me jump. I checked the locks on the doors 3-4 times a night. Eventually, the fear faded at least a little. I started telling myself maybe it was just an animal. Maybe someone else was camping out there, and we just didn't know about each other. But I don't believe that. Not really. I know what I heard. I know the way it moved. That was no camper. That wasn't some guy out for a hike. Someone was watching me. Someone got close enough to touch my tent. Twice. I haven't been camping since. I still love the forest, the mountains, the quiet. But I'll never go out there alone again. There's peace in the wild, but there's danger too. Especially from the things that don't want to be seen. Not because they're monsters or spirits or anything like that, but because they're real, flesh and blood, human, and they don't want to be found. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway. I had planned it for weeks, telling myself that it was exactly what I needed after a stressful year. I had rented a small cabin, tucked away in the middle of a dense forest. The pictures on the website made it seem like a charming little place, perfect for getting away from it all. The idea was simple: drive up, stay a few days, clear my head, and come back refreshed. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees, casting a soft orange glow over everything. The air smelled fresh, like pine and earth. I was excited, but there was a strange feeling in my chest, something that I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the isolation. The cabin was far off from the nearest town, and the road leading up to it was long and winding. No neighbors for miles, just the forest. The cabin itself looked like something out of a storybook. It was a rustic log cabin with a stone chimney and a small porch with a rocking chair. There were flowers planted near the door, and the windows were framed with thick, white curtains. Inside, it was cozy with a stone fireplace, a large leather couch, and a kitchen that seemed more than capable for a few days of cooking. Everything was neat, and everything seemed in order. I unpacked my bags, took a deep breath, and settled into the space. The quiet was almost too much. There were no cars, no distant voices, just the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional bird call. After a few hours, the night started to creep in, and I lit a fire in the fireplace. I had decided that I would spend my time reading, maybe cook a simple dinner, and relax. The silence seemed comforting at first, but as the night went on, something changed. It was subtle, like the atmosphere had shifted. I couldn't pinpoint it, but I started to feel uneasy. It was like the walls of the cabin were closing in on me. The sound of the fire crackling in the hearth was suddenly too loud, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself that it was just the result of being alone in a remote place, my mind playing tricks on me. I went to bed early, hoping that a good night's sleep would clear my head. But sleep didn't come easy. The bed was comfortable, but my mind raced. Every creak of the cabin's wooden beams seemed amplified in the dead quiet. I tossed and turned, listening to the faint noises outside, twigs snapping, leaves rustling in the wind, and the occasional howl of a distant animal. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A loud knock, like someone was banging on the door. My heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? I had driven up here alone, and there were no other cabins in sight. Maybe it was an animal? I tried to convince myself of that, but the knock came again, more insistent this time. I lay there, frozen. I had no idea what to do. Should I get up and check? Should I ignore it? The knock came again, but this time, it was followed by a strange scraping sound against the door, like something was being dragged along the wood. I waited, holding my breath, hoping that it would stop, hoping that it was just some trick of the wind. But it didn't stop. It went on for what felt like an eternity, the scraping sound getting louder and closer, until it felt like whatever was out there was right on the other side of the door. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed, my legs shaking as I moved toward the door. I grabbed the flashlight that was resting on the table near the door, turned it on, and slowly approached the entry. My pulse raced as I stood just a few inches away, holding the flashlight in front of me, preparing to open it. But I couldn't. Something told me not to. The silence outside was deafening now, and the only sound was the beating of my heart in my ears. For what felt like a lifetime, I stood there, staring at the door. Finally, I took a deep breath and slowly opened it. Nothing. There was no one there, just the dark forest, silent and still. I stepped out cautiously, shining my flashlight around. There was nothing unusual in sight, just trees and the faint light of the moon filtering through the canopy. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Could it have been an animal? Could it have been the wind? But no, the scraping sound. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. I stayed out for a few minutes, scanning the area, but saw nothing. Nothing moved in the trees. Nothing made a sound. Eventually, I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things. The next day, I tried to push everything to the back of my mind. I went for a hike in the morning, thinking some fresh air and exercise would clear my thoughts. The forest was beautiful, the sun shining through the branches, and the birds singing in the trees. But even though everything seemed peaceful, there was an underlying sense of tension that I couldn't shake. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking behind the trees. In the afternoon, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. I wanted to see if there was any sign of someone. Footprints, disturbances in the dirt, anything. I walked around the cabin, examining the ground closely. The dirt was soft, but there was no sign of anything unusual. No footprints, no broken branches, no disturbances. It was like nothing had happened. But then I found something. Behind the cabin, near the edge of the woods, there was a pile of rocks. It was unusual because they were stacked in a way that looked too deliberate. Someone had placed them there. I felt a chill run down my spine as I inspected the pile. Beneath the rocks, there was a small, weathered box. It was barely visible, half buried beneath the stones. I carefully reached for the box and pulled it free. It was made of wood, worn with age. When I opened it, my heart nearly stopped. Inside was a handful of old photographs, yellowed with time, and a small, rusted key. The photos showed different people, some smiling, some looking serious, all taken in front of what looked like the same cabin I was staying in. There was a sense of history to them. But what made my stomach turn was that in each photo, there was a figure standing in the background. It was blurry, hard to make out, but it looked like someone standing just outside the frame, watching. I didn't know what to do with the box. I kept it with me as I went back inside the cabin. My mind was racing. What did this all mean? Who had left this here? Was someone watching me? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing sounds again. Scraping, knocking, but I didn't dare open the door this time. I just lay in bed, clutching the box, my heart pounding with fear. The night dragged on endlessly, each second feeling like an hour. The next morning, I decided I had to leave. I packed my things in a rush, eager to get away from the cabin, from the forest, from whatever strange presence seemed to be watching me. I left the box in the cabin as a sign that whatever had happened here, it was not for me to understand. As I drove away, the winding road leading me further from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something trailing behind me, but nothing was there. By the time I reached the town, I felt like I had escaped something. I didn't know what exactly, but it felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. I didn't look back, and I didn't talk to anyone about it. The cabin, the strange events, the box, everything felt like a distant memory, fading with each passing mile. I never went back to that cabin. And to this day, I still don't know what I experienced. I have my theories, but I've learned to leave certain questions unanswered. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it wasn't. But what I do know is that sometimes it's better not to understand everything. Some things are better left alone. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. Work had been draining me every day, and I needed a break from the noise, the screens, and the constant buzz of people. I wanted to be alone, surrounded by trees and silence. So when I finally booked a few days off work, I didn't hesitate. I packed up my gear, checked the weather, and chose a small, lesser-known spot in north-central Oregon, just past the Deschutes National Forest. It was an area I hadn't visited before, but I had read online that it had good, isolated campsites with a mix of woods, creeks, and some small rock formations. Not too far from civilization if something went wrong, but far enough that I could be completely alone. I left on a Thursday morning in early October. The leaves had started to change, but the cold hadn't fully settled in yet. The drive took me about 4 hours. I stopped once for gas and snacks, then turned off the highway and followed a narrow gravel road for another 30 minutes. The last stretch got rough. The trees closed in tightly around the path, and the further I went, the fewer tire tracks I saw. Eventually, I parked where the road stopped and slung my pack over my shoulder. I had to hike another mile or so into the forest to get to the site I had picked on the map. The hike was peaceful, just birds and the wind in the trees. I had my GPS, printed trail notes, and a small compass just in case. After about 40 minutes, I found the clearing I had chosen. It wasn't a marked campsite, just a flat, dry patch between tall pines with some rocks and fallen logs nearby. A small creek ran about 150 feet to the west, and there was a steep hill behind me that helped block any wind. It was perfect. I set up my tent, made sure everything was secure, and gathered some wood for the fire. The sun was already starting to lower behind the trees by the time I finished. I sat by the fire with a cup of instant soup and listened to the woods. No voices, no cars, just the crackle of the fire and the slow sound of running water nearby. I remember thinking it was exactly what I needed. That night was calm. I slept better than I had in weeks. I didn't hear anything strange, just the usual nighttime forest sounds. An owl in the distance, maybe a raccoon rustling through the underbrush. Nothing unusual. I woke up a couple of times to shift around on the sleeping pad, but I never felt nervous. The woods felt still, like they were holding me. The second day, I went exploring. I followed the creek upstream for a while, found a dead tree full of woodpecker holes, and saw a few deer in the distance. I didn't see any other people. No tents, no garbage, not even boot prints. I kind of liked that. I was really alone out there, and it made everything feel more real. I collected more wood, made myself some coffee on my little stove, and took notes in the journal I brought. I wrote about the way the sun hit the trees in the afternoon, how quiet it was, and how I had barely thought about work once. It was all exactly what I had hoped for. I even took a few pictures on my phone, though I left it on airplane mode to save the battery. There wasn't any signal out there anyway. That night, things felt different. It wasn't anything big at first. I just felt a little more alert, like my body was tuning into something. The wind had picked up, and the fire didn't feel as warm as it had the night before. I kept thinking I was hearing small noises off in the woods, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing. No movement, no shapes in the dark, just silence. I convinced myself it was animals, maybe raccoons again, maybe even a bear, though I had hung my food bag high and far from camp, and I had made sure not to cook near my tent. Still, I felt uneasy. I stayed up later that night, letting the fire burn low. I kept the hatchet next to me, just in case. I didn't hear anything large moving around, but something didn't feel right. Eventually, I went into the tent and zipped it shut. I left the hatchet inside, next to my sleeping bag, and lay there for a while just listening. The wind kept blowing. Occasionally, I heard leaves crunching, but nothing close. I drifted off sometime after midnight. I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m. It wasn't a sound that woke me. It was silence. Everything had gone still. The wind was gone, and even the creek sounded distant, like it had moved away from me. I sat up in the tent and held my breath. There was a tight feeling in my chest. I listened for anything. Footsteps, breathing, a branch cracking, but there was nothing. Just complete, solid silence. It felt like being underwater. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. I didn't shine it outside right away. I just listened. Then I stepped out and turned the light on. The beam hit the trees and lit up a small circle of forest. Everything looked the same, my fire pit, the logs, my chair, but the air felt wrong, heavy. I turned the flashlight slowly in a circle, scanning the trees. No eyes, no shapes, nothing. But when I turned the light toward the path that led down to the creek, I saw something strange. A line of disturbed leaves. It looked like someone had walked through the underbrush recently. Not an animal, there were no paw prints, no digging. It was a long, narrow path through the leaves, like someone dragging their feet. It started near the creek and led straight toward my camp, then curved slightly off to the side, maybe 20 feet from my tent. I froze. I followed the path with the flashlight, careful not to move too fast. The trail stopped near a tree just beyond the edge of my camp. I stepped closer. The leaves had been pushed aside, and I could see dirt where the ground had been disturbed. I crouched down to look. It was a footprint, a human footprint, barefoot. I stood up fast and backed away, nearly tripping over a rock behind me. I shined the flashlight around again, but I didn't see anything. No one was there, just the footprint, the line through the leaves, and that thick, horrible silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the tent with my flashlight and hatchet, watching the woods. I kept expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree, but no one came. The air stayed quiet, too quiet, like the forest was waiting for something. When the sun finally came up, I stood and stretched my legs. My knees were stiff from sitting all night. I checked the ground again. The footprint was still there. I followed the path down to the creek. The trail disappeared a few feet before the water. I couldn't find where it came from. No other tracks, no boots, no bags, no signs of camping. Just that one barefoot print and the line through the leaves. I packed up my gear right after that. I didn't even make breakfast. I just shoved everything into my pack and took down the tent. My hands were shaking the whole time. I kept turning around, checking the woods. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The hike back to the car felt twice as long. I kept thinking I heard footsteps behind me, but every time I stopped, the sound stopped too. I kept looking over my shoulder. My heart wouldn't slow down. When I finally got to the car, I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors. I sat there for a few minutes just breathing. Then I started the engine and drove back down the gravel road. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. Even then, I didn't feel safe. It took me a long time to stop thinking about that footprint. I reported it to the local ranger station when I got home, just in case. I didn't know what to say exactly. I told them I saw signs that someone might have been in the area, walking barefoot at night. They said they'd check it out, but I never heard anything back. I tried to forget it, to convince myself it was just some odd hiker or maybe a local wandering around. But that doesn't make sense. Who hikes into the woods barefoot in October, doesn't bring any gear, and walks right up to someone's tent in the middle of the night without ever saying a word? It's been over a year now. I haven't been back to that part of the forest. I still camp, but I choose sites with other people nearby. I bring better locks for the tent. I check the ground around me more carefully, and I don't sleep without the hatchet close by. Whatever was out there that night didn't want to be seen. It didn't try to take anything. It didn't make a sound. It just got close enough to let me know I wasn't alone. And that was enough. I was 31 the year I decided to disappear for a while. Not from anything dramatic, not from the law or someone chasing me. I was just tired. I'd worked construction for most of my 20s, long shifts under the sun, dealing with supervisors who barely remembered your name. My knees were giving out and my back felt older than my dad's. So when I got laid off in late spring of 2019, I didn't look for new work right away. I took it as a sign. I had a bit of money saved, not a lot, but enough to float for a few months if I lived cheap. A guy I knew, Rick, used to hunt in northern Wisconsin, and he told me about a place he'd stayed in, an old hunting cabin near Lac View Desert, barely an hour from the Michigan border. He said it was rustic, had no cell service, and nobody went near it after the snow melted because there wasn't much game around. It belonged to a friend of his uncle's or something. He said I could probably rent it for next to nothing if I called the owner directly. So I did. The guy didn't care much. He said if I wanted to give him $400 for the month and not burn it down, the key was under a cement frog by the door. So I packed up my old blue Tacoma with canned food, fishing gear, some tools, and a couple of paperbacks. I didn't bring a laptop. No internet. That was the point. I was gonna go off the grid for a while. Just get away from all the noise. I drove up in early June. It took me almost 8 hours from my apartment in Madison. I'd never been that far north before, and the last hour of driving was nothing but trees. The paved roads turned into cracked gravel, and eventually into what felt like trails. I passed a few old houses that looked like no one had lived in them since the 90s. Faded mailboxes with names I couldn't pronounce, old trucks rusting into the earth. The cabin was farther out than I thought. It wasn't even marked. I had to turn off onto a trail that was barely wide enough for my truck. The trees were so close they brushed the sides as I drove in. When I finally got there, it was smaller than I expected. One story, maybe 20 feet wide. It had a screened porch out front and a metal chimney sticking up from the back like a bent finger. The woods around it were thick and alive. The kind of alive that's almost loud. Insects, birds, whined through leaves. I liked it immediately. I found the frog, got the key, and opened the door. The inside smelled like wood smoke and old leather. There was one big room with a stone fireplace, a dusty green couch, a table with 2 chairs, and a kitchen area with a propane stove and a dented fridge that didn't work. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a small bathroom with no mirror and a dry toilet I'd have to empty into a compost bin outside. There was a small window in the bedroom that looked out toward the woods behind the cabin. I set my bags down, cracked a beer, and sat on the porch. The only sounds were birds, the creak of trees, and the distant buzzing of bugs. No cars, no people. It was perfect. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my mornings fishing at a small stream I'd found about a half-mile from the cabin. I'd pack a sandwich, bring a folding chair, and sit by the water for hours. I didn't catch much, but I didn't care. I wasn't there for that. I'd read a lot, took naps, cooked beans and rice on the propane stove. Once or twice, I saw deer in the distance, and one morning I spotted a black bear, just lumbering across the path, not bothering with me. I kept my food sealed tight after that. By the second week, though, things started to shift a little. Not anything big, not at first. Just small details that didn't feel right. The first thing was the footprints. There was a clearing out behind the cabin, maybe 30 feet from the back door. I used it as a spot to dump compost and trash. One morning, I walked out there with a bucket of food scraps, and I saw boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. These were deep, with a square heel and a thick tread. I wore sneakers or sandals every day, nothing that would leave a print like that. And these were fresh, pressed into the damp earth like someone had walked through just that morning. I looked around, called out once, but of course there was no answer. Just trees and brush. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the property. There wasn't any fence or anything, but I figured maybe someone had been hiking. It was public land past a certain point. Still, it didn't sit right. I didn't sleep well that night. The next few days were quiet again. I tried to forget about it. Then on Thursday, I went to grab one of my tackle boxes from under the porch, and it was gone. I was sure I'd put it back. I remembered placing it beside the bucket with extra fishing line. Now it was just gone. I thought maybe I'd left it by the stream, but when I walked down there, nothing. I checked all around the cabin. Nothing. I kept my truck locked, but I checked that too. Nothing. Now I started to get that feeling. You know, the one. Like someone's been in your space. Like the air has changed and doesn't belong to you anymore. That night, I sat up late, reading on the porch with a lantern. I kept listening for sounds, for movement. A few times I thought I heard something. Sticks cracking, a low shuffle in the trees, but it could have been anything. Could have been a raccoon. Could have been the wind. But the next morning, I found something that made it all feel real. On the window outside the bedroom, on the outside, was a greasy handprint. Full-sized, right in the center of the glass. Like someone had leaned forward and pressed their palm flat against it. 5 fingers, smudged with dirt or oil. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I hadn't seen or heard a single car since I got there. No visitors, no neighbors, no reason anyone would be out here. It was too far, too hidden. Whoever left that handprint knew I was here. They'd come up close to the cabin. They'd looked inside. That day, I cleaned the rifle I'd brought. I'd only used it once for target practice, but now I loaded it and kept it beside the bed. I didn't sleep well again. Every sound outside made me sit up, heart pounding. 3 days passed. Nothing happened. I didn't go to the stream anymore. I stayed close. I kept the doors locked. I peered out the windows before stepping outside. I told myself maybe it was just a hiker, some random weirdo passing through. But then came the worst night. It started like any other. I ate dinner, just beans and eggs, and sat on the porch until the sun dipped low. The light in the woods went orange, then blue, then gone. I went inside and locked the door. I turned off all the lights and laid in bed with the rifle beside me. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. No loud sound, no dream. Just that sharp, silent kind of waking where your brain tells you something's wrong. The window was open. I never opened that window. It was small, hard to crank, and didn't have a screen. But now it was cracked open an inch, just wide enough to let in cold air. I sat up in bed and stared. The moonlight made the room glow pale blue. My heart thudded like a drum. And then I saw movement. A shape just outside. Not a face, not a clear figure. Just something there, low and hunched. Like someone crouched beside the cabin wall, just beneath the window. Waiting, listening. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just sat frozen, staring at that inch of black space between the window and the frame. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. After what felt like forever, the shape shifted. It stood slowly, like someone pushing up from a crouch. And then it moved away. I didn't hear it walk. I just saw the shadow slide out of view. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink, I think. I sat up until morning, holding the rifle, eyes locked on that window. When it was finally light, I walked outside. There were more prints in the dirt now. Not just in the clearing, *right* outside the window. Deep and messy, same boots. And on the side of the cabin, scratched into the wood with something sharp, was a line. Just a single horizontal gouge, as long as my arm, carved low into the wall. Like someone had dragged a knife or a key straight across it. That was it for me. I packed that day, shoved everything into the truck as fast as I could. I didn't care about cleaning. I didn't care about the trash. I just needed to get out. I didn't even go back to lock the door. I drove until I hit the main road, then farther until I had bars on my phone again. I pulled over in front of a gas station and just sat there, letting my hands stop shaking. I didn't report it. What could I say? That someone was near my cabin? That I saw a shape in the night? There was no proof, no faces, no names. Just tracks and a handprint. I never went back. Later, I told Rick what happened. He said the owner of the cabin didn't want to hear about it. Said the guy was old, didn't care, probably wouldn't even fix the window. That was 6 years ago. Sometimes I still dream about that window, about the inch of open space and the shape crouched outside. I still lock every door and check every window, even if I'm just going to bed in my apartment. I wanted quiet. I wanted to get away from people. But the thing is, you never really know who's out there. You think It was the summer of 2017. I was 34 years old, working as a freelance photographer, mostly doing nature work. That year, I had taken on fewer assignments to make space for personal projects. One of those projects was to explore lesser-known camping spots in the western part of Colorado and photograph them in different lighting, sunrise, sunset, and under overcast skies. I had a decent 4x4 and a set of sturdy camping gear I'd built up over the years. I wasn't new to camping. I'd spent weeks alone in remote forests, on mountain trails, and even desert edges. I was confident in my skills: navigation, first aid, building fires, filtering water, you name it. I'd never had a real scare before, not even close. There was this area I'd been reading about online called Echo Valley. It wasn't in any big tourist guides. Just a handful of off-the-grid forums mentioned it. Supposedly, it was a forgotten trail near the western slope of the Uncompahgre Plateau, surrounded by steep hills, pine trees, and a creek that ran year-round. Some folks said it used to be a scout campsite back in the 80s, but after a bad flood, people stopped going. No one I personally knew had been there. That's what pulled me in. I planned a 3-day solo trip. I packed light but carefully: tent, sleeping bag, knife, bear spray, a .357 revolver I always brought on remote trips, portable stove, water purifier, satellite phone, and extra batteries. I loaded up my truck with food sealed in odor-proof bags and headed out on a Monday morning. It was early August, hot during the day, but the nights were cold up there. I reached the nearest service road by mid-afternoon, then drove another 40 minutes on a barely visible dirt path until I couldn't go further without risking damage to the truck. From there, it was a 2-hour hike into the woods. The path was overgrown but visible enough if you looked for broken branches or slight indentations in the grass. I followed the creek upstream as suggested in the forums. By the time I reached a decent flat area next to the creek, it was nearly 6 p.m. I set up camp fast, pitched the tent, gathered dry wood for a fire, and filtered water. There was a strange stillness in the air. The only sound was the water running over rocks and the occasional bird. No wind.
No insects buzzing.
Just quiet. I chalked it up to being deep in the valley, away from everything. That first night was uneventful. I made a small fire, heated up a can of chili, and sat with my back against a tree, watching the stars come out. Around 10 p.m., I turned in. The ground was firm but not too rocky. I slept well. The second day I spent exploring. I walked a couple of miles in each direction along the creek, taking photos and marking my path with biodegradable tape so I could find my way back. I noticed some old fire rings and metal stakes in the ground, signs people had camped here years ago. At one point, I found a rusted-out Coleman stove buried under leaves. That confirmed the scout camp theory. Around late afternoon, I hiked up a ridge on the north side of the valley to get a wide-angle photo of the area. That's when I saw something that made me stop. Across the valley, maybe half a mile away, near the tree line, I saw a glint, like light reflecting off glass or metal. It was brief, maybe half a second, but enough to catch my attention. I stared for a while, waiting to see it again, but nothing moved. I figured it could be an old beer bottle or maybe a deer moving through a sunbeam. I took a few photos and headed back down before the light disappeared. That night, after dinner, I sat by the fire again. The same stillness surrounded me. At one point, I thought I heard a soft cracking sound in the distance, like a branch snapping under weight, but it didn't repeat, and I've heard branches fall on their own plenty of times. Still, I kept the revolver closer to my sleeping bag than usual. I woke up sometime after midnight. I didn't know what exactly woke me, but my eyes shot open. My tent was closed, and everything was quiet. Too quiet. The creek sounded muffled, like something was dampening the air. I lay there for a minute, listening, holding my breath. Then I heard it again. A soft crunch, like footsteps on dry leaves, not too far from the tent. Now, footsteps in the woods don't always mean danger. Deer walk through camps. Raccoons snoop around. But these steps were slow and deliberate: step, pause, step, pause. I sat up slowly, grabbed the revolver, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black except for the moonlight filtering through the pines. The fire was out, just embers. I stayed like that for about 5 minutes, staring into the woods, heart pounding. Nothing moved. Eventually, the steps faded. I didn't hear them leave, just nothing again. I stayed awake until dawn, lying still, gun in hand, ears straining. As the sky lightened, birds returned, and the normal forest sounds came back. It was like whatever had been near was gone with the dark. I got up, made coffee, and checked the perimeter. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign of animals or people. I debated cutting the trip short, but stubbornness won out. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe just my nerves. Still, I didn't stray too far that third day. I stayed close to camp, kept the fire going, and spent more time watching than taking pictures. Around noon, I heard something faint in the distance. Sounded like metal clanging. Not loud, but out of place. I couldn't place the direction. It lasted maybe 2 seconds and stopped. No echo, no follow-up. I climbed back up the ridge that evening, hoping to catch the sunset and maybe figure out what I'd seen the day before. This time, I brought my telephoto lens. I scanned the tree line where I'd seen the glint. Nothing. But when I looked slightly west of that spot, I noticed something odd. A small structure barely visible between trees. It looked like wood, maybe a shed or an old cabin. I hadn't noticed it before, probably hidden by the angle or lighting. I zoomed in and snapped a few photos. The building looked weathered, almost collapsed in parts. But what really got me was a figure, a person, standing outside it, dressed in dark clothes, still as stone, facing the valley. I froze. The distance was too far to see details, but this wasn't a hunter. No orange vest, no gear, just a lone figure staring. I packed up fast and rushed down the ridge, heart racing. I didn't run. I didn't want to draw attention, but I moved fast. Back at camp, I didn't eat. I doused the fire early and climbed into the tent just before sunset. I kept the gun in my hand. I didn't sleep. All night I listened. I heard rustling a few times, faint sounds, too far to pinpoint. Once I thought I heard breathing outside the tent. Not loud, but close enough that I held my breath and didn't move for 10 minutes. By morning, I'd had enough. I packed everything up by 6 a.m., barely stopping to eat. I loaded my gear and began the hike back to the truck. I checked behind me every few minutes. My nerves were shredded. When I reached the truck and locked the doors, I sat there for 5 minutes, just breathing. I started the engine and took off down the dirt road, only slowing when I hit pavement again. I drove straight to the nearest town, Montrose, checked into a cheap motel and showered for an hour. Later that night, I looked through the photos I'd taken. The structure was clearer in one of the shots. Definitely a shed or one-room cabin. The figure, though, it was gone. In the photo, there was no one there, just trees. I could have sworn I saw someone. I stared at it for hours, zoomed in, changed contrast, brightness, nothing. I reported the cabin to the ranger station the next day, told them I thought someone might be squatting out there and acting strangely. They said they'd look into it. I never heard back. I never went back to Echo Valley. I still go camping, but I stick to known areas now, trails with other people nearby. That trip changed something in me. It wasn't fear of animals or getting lost. It was the silence, the way the air felt wrong, the way someone or something moved through those woods without making a sound when it wanted to. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters. I believe in people, and I think someone was watching me out there. Maybe they lived there. Maybe they didn't like visitors. Maybe they were just waiting to see what I'd do. I didn't stay long enough to find out, and I never will. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. Something about the quiet of nature, the simplicity of just being alone with my thoughts, appealed to me. My name is Thomas, and at 29 years old, I'd gone on a few solo trips in the past, but nothing quite like this. It was late October, and the air had started to cool as the day ended. I was camping in the remote wilderness of the Rocky Mountains, just outside a small town in Colorado. There wasn't much around, just miles of untouched forest and the occasional trail. Perfect for solitude. I'd set up camp earlier that day, near a small creek. It was the kind of spot you dream about when you think of camping. Beautiful views, the sound of running water nearby, and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. My tent was pitched neatly, and my campfire crackled as I sat in front of it, preparing some food for the evening. I didn't have a whole lot, just a small portable stove, some dried meals, and a couple of cans of beans. As night fell, the forest seemed to grow quieter, the sounds of the birds and animals that were so present during the day fading into a soft hush. Only the crackling of the fire and the occasional splash of water from the creek broke the silence. It was peaceful, too peaceful almost, but I didn't think much of it. After finishing my meal, I decided to explore a bit. not straying too far from camp. The air was crisp, the ground damp with the remnants of the day's moisture. My boots crunched the fallen leaves beneath me as I walked along the creek, watching the water meander through the rocks. The trees around me were tall and imposing, their branches swaying in the wind. It was a scene right out of a painting, yet something about the stillness felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought I was. I laughed it off at first. After all, I was in the middle of a national forest. Of course, there would be wildlife, bears, mountain lions, deer. I had read about these dangers before coming out here, but I figured I had nothing to worry about. I wasn't near any bear dens or known mountain lion habitats. Still, as I walked along the creek, I felt eyes on me. Maybe it was the sound of my footsteps amplifying in the silence, or maybe it was just my imagination running wild. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me. As the minutes passed, I began to feel uneasy. The forest, usually so serene, felt claustrophobic. The trees seemed taller, the darkness deeper. I turned around and made my way back to camp quickly, brushing off the creeping paranoia that was beginning to settle in. When I arrived back at my tent, the fire was still burning, but the warmth from it seemed to have dimmed somehow. I fed more wood into the flames and sat down again, hoping the fire's crackling would calm my nerves. The night was now fully upon me, and the temperature had dropped considerably. I pulled on a jacket and zipped myself into my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the chill in the air. But as I lay there, staring up at the roof of the tent, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The wind outside had picked up, and the branches of the trees creaked and groaned in the gusts. Every little sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. Hours passed in a restless half-sleep, my mind constantly drifting between wakefulness and dreams. The wind outside howled, the tent shaking lightly with each gust. I had just started to doze off when I heard it, a faint noise just barely audible over the wind. At first, I thought it was the sound of a large animal moving through the forest. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear. But it wasn't the rustling I had expected. This was different. It was almost like the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I held my breath, straining to hear. There it was again, a soft, shuffling noise, like someone walking through the underbrush. My heart began to race, and I found myself holding my breath. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snapping of twigs underfoot. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving slowly, purposefully, as if they were aware of my presence. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent, and for a long moment, everything was silent. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I wasn't sure what to do. The idea of going out there to check was absurd. If it was an animal, I didn't want to risk startling it. But if it was a person, that thought sent a chill through me. I had read stories about people who went missing in the wild, never to be seen again, and now, alone in the dark forest, I wondered if I might be next. The minutes dragged on, the silence deafening. I waited, barely moving, listening for any sign of activity. The footsteps, if that's what they had been, didn't come back. Maybe I had imagined them, I thought. My nerves had been shot all day, and I had probably just been hearing things. But that didn't explain the faint scraping sound I heard next. A sound like something, or someone, was dragging something heavy along the forest floor. The sound was distant, but it was there. I slowly unzipped my tent just enough to peek out, but I didn't see anything. No movement, no sign of life. I stared into the dark forest, the firelight casting long, distorted shadows on the trees. Nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. I spent the rest of the hours listening to every crack and groan the forest made, eyes darting to every shadow, convinced something was out there. By morning, I was exhausted, my eyes heavy with lack of sleep. But as I packed up my things and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sensation of being watched persisted, even as I made my way back to the car. When I reached the trailhead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A set of large footprints, deep and unmistakable, led right up to the edge of the trail, just where I had camped. They weren't from an animal. They were human. I quickly got into my car and drove away, never looking back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that part of the forest again. I was 32 when I rented that cabin. It was early November 2019. I had just quit my job at a roofing company in Allentown, Pennsylvania, after a stupid argument with the supervisor. He blamed me for damage on a site I wasn't even on. I'd been dealing with that kind of crap for years, and that day something inside just gave out. I tossed my hard hat on the truck seat, clocked out, and never went back. I didn't really have a plan. I had maybe $5,000 saved up, no wife or kids to worry about. My brother tried to talk me into staying with him and his girlfriend in Lancaster for a while, but I didn't want to be a burden or sit on a couch feeling useless. I needed to get out, be alone, clear my head. So I searched online for cabins for rent. Not resorts or anything fancy, just a plain, private place out in the sticks. I ended up finding a listing on some forum. It wasn't even a proper website. This guy named Ron posted that he had an old hunting cabin near Clinton County, about 20 miles outside of a town called Renovo, and he was willing to rent it out for cheap during the off-season. It was rough, no running water, no electricity, just a generator and a propane heater. No cell service either, but I liked the idea of being cut off from everything. I messaged him, wired half the money up front, and got directions to the place. He mailed me an old-fashioned paper map with a hand-drawn route marked in red. That should have been the first red flag. The drive up was beautiful. 2-lane roads winding through hills and dead forests. Leaves were mostly off the trees, and everything had that quiet, gray tone. The kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. Took me almost 4 hours from Allentown. I followed Ron's map exactly, and I found the dirt path he marked after a long stretch past a gas station that looked closed for the season. The dirt road was narrow and full of potholes. My old Ford Ranger shook like hell going up. After about 15 minutes of crawling through the woods, I saw it, the cabin. It was set in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. No signs of other people, no tire tracks except mine. The roof sagged in the middle. The siding was dark wood, cracked in places, and there was a small chimney poking out of one side. A rusted metal shed sat about 30 feet to the right. There was no lock on the cabin door, just a wooden bar you could slide into place from the inside. I stepped in and looked around. There was one room, a cot, a small table with 2 folding chairs, a wood stove in the corner, and some old shelves stacked with canned food and matches. A 5-gallon water jug sat by the wall. Everything smelled like dust and mildew. I unpacked my stuff, just some clothes, a few tools, a bunch of bottled water, and a cooler with food, and set up the cot. There was a little solar lantern on the table, and the generator sat outside behind the shed. I didn't turn it on. I didn't need power just yet. I lit a couple candles, opened a can of beans, and ate straight from the tin. That first night was quiet. The wind rattled the windows now and then, and I heard a few branches snap in the woods, but nothing that really got to me. I didn't sleep great, but I wasn't scared either. Just felt off. I figured it was the isolation. I told myself I'd feel better in the morning. The next few days were mostly the same. I chopped some firewood from a fallen tree nearby, stacked it against the side of the cabin. I spent hours walking through the woods, just trying to kill time. There were no trails, and the forest felt dense and untouched. Every now and then I'd see animal tracks or droppings, but I never spotted anything larger than a squirrel. The weirdness started around day 4. I had gone about a mile into the woods to check out a small stream I found on the second day. I liked the sound of running water. It gave the place a bit of life. But that day, the stream was gone. I swear it. The rocks were there, still wet, but no water. It was like someone turned off a faucet. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty bed, trying to figure it out. Maybe it was seasonal, I thought. Maybe it dried up sometimes. I shrugged it off and headed back to the cabin. But I couldn't find the path. I had been using broken twigs and small stacks of rocks to mark my way back, but they were gone. I retraced my steps, or tried to, but nothing looked right. Every direction looked the same, just trees and more trees. I didn't panic at first. I had a compass in my jacket. I pulled it out, turned west like I always did, and walked for about an hour. When I saw the cabin again, I almost cried. Not from fear, just relief. I didn't like how fast that turned into something deeper, something colder. That night, I didn't light any candles. I just lay there on the cot, eyes open, listening. The wind had stopped. Total silence. Not even bugs. Sometime past midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow ones. Not crunching leaves. More like pressing against them. Like someone trying to walk quiet. I sat up, heart pounding, grabbed the hatchet I kept near the cot. I didn't breathe. The steps circled the cabin. One loop, then nothing. I waited an hour before I moved. I pressed my face to the window but saw only black trees. No flashlight, no sounds. Just trees. Next morning, I walked the entire perimeter of the cabin. No prints. No broken branches. Nothing to prove anyone had been there. I tried to radio for help that day. I had a little emergency CB radio in my truck. I climbed in, tried every channel. Static. I turned on the truck and considered driving out, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared. Maybe I thought I was just getting in my own head. The isolation was messing with me. That night, the generator started by itself. I hadn't touched it in days. It was an old pull-start Honda model. No electric start, no timer. Just suddenly roaring to life behind the shed. I bolted outside with the hatchet. No one there. No footprints. I shut it off and rolled it into the cabin. That thing was heavy, must have been 90 pounds. I locked it inside with me. Next morning, I found all the canned food open and dumped on the floor. Not eaten, just opened and emptied. Clean slices down the side of each tin like someone used a proper opener. My opener was still on the shelf. I packed everything, tossed it all in the truck and started driving down the dirt road. About half a mile in, the path was blocked. A tree had fallen. I got out, checked it. It hadn't rotted or snapped in the wind. It was cut, clean through like with a saw. I hadn't heard any chainsaws or engines. I would have. I backed up, turned around, tried a different route I had seen on the map. It looked promising, just another dirt path heading east. But that ended in a ditch. No way around it. I went back to the cabin. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the table, lantern on, hatchet in one hand, flashlight in the other. I stared at the door. Nothing happened. No steps, no sounds. Just waiting. By the 6th day, I had started writing things down. Notes, times, locations. Trying to make sense of it. I found myself checking the same parts of the forest again and again. I left markings, deep ones. Chipped bark, tied bits of shirt fabric. Every time I walked back, they were gone. Like the woods were scrubbing themselves clean. I was running out of food. Only a few bottles of water left. I stopped trusting the jug in the cabin. The water tasted weird, like plastic and dirt. I thought about boiling it, but the stove wouldn't stay lit. It would catch, then die out, even with fresh kindling and paper. Day 8, I found footprints. Barefoot, human, small, almost child-sized, leading from the shed to the tree line. I followed them for 100 feet. Then they vanished. Not like someone turned around, just gone. I moved the cot in front of the door that night, slept with the hatchet across my chest. I dreamed of a face watching me from the window, but when I woke up, nothing was there. On day 10, I tried walking straight west again. I made it farther than before, about 3 miles, I think. I climbed a small ridge and saw something in the distance. A clearing and what looked like a road. Real road. Asphalt. I ran, sprinting through brush, thorns ripping my pants, branches slapping my face. But when I got to the clearing, it was just more woods. No road, just a shadow playing tricks. I screamed, loud, over and over. My throat felt raw. I didn't care who heard me. I slept in the truck that night, windows up, doors locked. When I woke up, there were smudges on the passenger side window. Handprints, not full ones, just greasy smears like someone leaned against the glass. That morning, the key to the cabin was gone. I had left it in the ignition, nowhere to be found. The door was wide open, Inside, every item was stacked in the center of the room, neatly. My bags, the lantern, the stove, even the empty cans, like someone had made a little shrine. That broke me. I left everything, grabbed my wallet, It was early autumn when I decided to get away from everything. My life had been a blur of work, emails, phone calls, and endless demands. I hadn't taken a real break in years, and with the weather turning colder, I figured it would be the perfect time for some solitude. I found an old cabin in the woods through an online listing. The photos looked charming, the price was reasonable, and the location was remote enough that I could forget about the world for a while. The cabin was in the Appalachian foothills, somewhere deep in rural Kentucky. I wasn't exactly sure how I would get there, just some vague directions and a GPS that was notoriously unreliable, but the idea of being completely cut off from everything appealed to me. No distractions, no work, just me and the woods. I rented a car for the drive. It was a long one. The roads grew smaller the farther I went, the trees towering over me like ancient sentinels, their branches weaving together to form a dark canopy. It felt like driving through a tunnel made of leaves and shadows, the air growing cooler with each mile. The cabin itself was located about an hour outside of the nearest town. I was grateful for the isolation. There wasn't even cell service out there, which meant I wouldn't be able to check emails or social media. For the first time in years, I could truly disconnect. When I arrived, the cabin was everything I had hoped for. It was small, built with rough-hewn logs, and sat beside a creek that gurgled peacefully in the background. There was a porch swing that looked worn from age but still inviting. The roof was a bit saggy in places, and the steps creaked as I climbed them, but the place had character. It wasn't much, but it felt like it belonged here, tucked away from the world. I unpacked my bag, set up in the cozy living room, and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that made your skin tingle and your breath turn to mist in the air. I could hear the soft rustling of the leaves outside and the creek in the distance. I sat by the window, watching the trees sway in the breeze, and felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. That night, I made a simple dinner, nothing too fancy, just canned soup and crackers. I didn't want to fuss with anything complicated. The quiet was almost deafening, though. No traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustling of the trees and the wind pushing against the cabin. I felt oddly exposed, yet at the same time, I was thankful for the silence. I spent the evening reading a book by the fireplace. The flames crackled and popped, sending little embers up the chimney. It was comfortable and I was starting to relax. The place felt safe, warm. But then, around midnight, things started to feel different. I just finished a chapter when I heard a sound outside the cabin. It was faint at first, almost like the wind shifting, but it wasn't the wind. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. A soft thud, followed by a scraping noise. I froze, my heart picking up speed. It sounded like something, or someone, was walking around the cabin. I sat still for a long time, listening. There was nothing for a while, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional thump of wood settling. But then it came again, louder this time. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was outside. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky, and moved toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but I parted them just enough to peek out into the darkness. There was nothing, just the outline of trees, the shadows of branches swaying in the breeze. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I forced myself to relax, but the noise continued, growing louder as the night stretched on. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape. Each time it was closer. By now, I was no longer convinced it was an animal. The sound was too human, too intentional. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and slowly crept to the door. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands felt clammy as I turned the deadbolt. I opened the door just a crack and shone the flashlight into the yard. There was nothing, just the creek running quietly beside the cabin, the trees, and the darkness. I stepped outside, squinting into the night, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the thick blackness. The sound stopped abruptly. I waited, holding my breath, listening. Nothing, just the soft gurgling of the creek. I stood there for what felt like an eternity before I finally stepped back inside. My mind was racing. Who could be out there? Was it a person, or just my imagination running wild? The rest of the night passed without incident, but I didn't sleep much. Every little sound made me jump. The wind against the walls, the occasional crack of a branch, the distant howl of a coyote. It all seemed to come at me in waves, each one feeling a little more menacing than the last. The next morning, I woke up to a gray sky, the clouds thick and heavy. The air was damp, and it looked like it was going to rain. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. Maybe the solitude was getting to me, or maybe I was just overthinking things. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, following a narrow trail that ran along the creek. The water was higher than usual, swollen from the previous night's rain, and it rushed past in a way that felt almost angry. The trees were dense here, and the forest seemed to stretch on forever. I walked for a couple of hours, enjoying the fresh air, but my mind kept drifting back to last night. What had I heard? What had I felt? Just as I was about to turn back, I came across something strange. There, in the middle of the trail, was a footprint. It wasn't very clear, but it was unmistakably human. Barefoot, the toes splayed out, the outline of the foot imprinted in the wet dirt. I crouched down, inspecting it. The footprint was fresh, the edges still soft. Whoever had made it had been here recently. My heart raced as I looked around, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The rest of the walk back to the cabin was a blur. My mind kept replaying the scene over and over. Who was out there? Had someone been watching me last night? I spent the rest of the day in the cabin, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. I didn't want to be paranoid. I told myself it was just an animal or maybe someone passing through. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, the sounds returned. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape. But this time, they didn't stop. They continued on, relentless, until I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door, stepping outside once again. The cold air hit me immediately, and I shivered. I scanned the area, but there was nothing. Then I heard it, a rustling from the trees. I spun around, the beam of the flashlight dancing across the woods. There, just on the edge of the trees, I saw something. A figure standing still, barely visible in the shadows. My heart stopped. I didn't know who it was or why they were there. I didn't wait to find out. I rushed back inside the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. I bolted the deadbolt, locked the windows, and turned off the lights. My breath came fast and shallow as I sat on the couch, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. I didn't sleep again that night. Every noise, every creak, every crackle of the fire made my blood run cold. The next morning, I packed up as quickly as I could. I didn't want to wait around any longer. I grabbed my things, checked the cabin for anything out of place, and locked the door behind me. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The forest seemed to close in on it, as if it were swallowing it whole. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I never went back to that cabin. It was the middle of autumn, and I had taken a long weekend to get away from the city. Life had been chaotic. Work had been a constant grind, and my personal space felt suffocating. I decided to book a cabin in the woods, somewhere secluded. The idea was to get away from it all, disconnect, and clear my mind. The place I found was tucked deep in the woods, about 3 hours away from the nearest town. The listing promised peace and solitude, perfect for a solo retreat. I arrived late in the afternoon, the golden light of the setting sun filtering through the trees. The cabin was rustic, weathered wood with a small porch and a metal roof that looked like it had seen better days. A single dirt road led up to it, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There wasn't another house for miles. No sound except for the rustling of the wind through the trees. After settling in and unpacking, I made my way around the property. The air was crisp, cool enough to make me zip up my jacket. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and there were no other signs of life. No animals, no people. The only noise was the occasional creak of the cabin as the wind pushed against it. As evening set in, I lit a fire in the small fireplace inside the cabin, the crackling of the logs filling the space. The glow of the flames danced across the wooden walls, casting shadows in every corner. I poured myself a drink and sat back, enjoying the stillness. There were no distractions here. Just me, the fire, and the silence of the forest. The wind outside picked up, and with it came the distant sound of branches snapping. I looked out the window, but there was nothing unusual. The forest was dark, the trees looming like silent sentinels, their shapes barely visible in the night. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it wasn't. It was a low thudding sound, almost like something, or someone, was moving around outside the cabin. My heart began to race, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, but deep down, something didn't feel right. The thudding continued for a while, growing louder and more erratic. It wasn't the sound of a tree branch hitting the cabin or wind blowing debris around. This was something deliberate, something that wasn't natural. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way to the door, my mind racing with possibilities, none of which seemed good. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, shaking slightly in my hand. I opened the door just enough to peer out into the woods. The beam of light barely reached the edge of the porch, and beyond that, the darkness swallowed everything. The thudding had stopped, but now there was an unsettling silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining my ears, trying to hear something, anything, that would explain the noise. And then, a low whisper of a rustling sound came from the tree line. It was distant, but unmistakable, like something moving through the underbrush. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was probably an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't want to be one of those people who let their fear take control, but something in me told me to stay inside. I locked the door and made my way back to the fireplace, the warm glow offering little comfort now. I sat by the fire, trying to calm my breathing. The sounds outside continued, faint at first, but then they grew louder again. Something dragging through the leaves, slowly, methodically. I sat there for hours, unsure whether I should try to sleep or stay awake and keep watch. The longer I listened, the more I felt the tension building in the air. It was suffocating. There was something out there, something that shouldn't be. But as the hours passed, the noise eventually stopped. The eerie silence returned, but it was a silence that felt wrong, unnatural. The next morning, I woke up to find that nothing seemed out of place. The sun was shining, birds were chirping in the distance, and the world outside seemed calm. But the dread from the night before lingered. I didn't want to leave the cabin, not yet. I decided to stay another night, figuring that maybe I'd been overreacting. After all, there was no evidence of anything strange happening. But when I went outside to take a walk, I noticed something unsettling. The dirt path leading from the cabin was disturbed. There were large footprints in the soft earth, footprints that clearly weren't from any animal I recognized. They were human-sized, but the shape was off, too wide, too deep. It looked like someone had been walking around the property, and they'd been here recently. I traced the footprints with my eyes, but they didn't lead anywhere. They started at the cabin and then just stopped. There was no sign of anyone nearby, no indication of where they had gone. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone here. I went back inside the cabin, locked the door, and tried to think. What was happening? Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? The thought that I was being watched again crept into my mind, and the feeling of dread settled in like a heavy weight. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, but now it sounded different. It wasn't just the wind. It sounded like voices, faint and distorted, carried by the gusts. I tried to ignore it, but every time I looked out the window, I thought I saw something moving in the distance, between the trees. It was too far to make out clearly, but the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. I kept the lights low and the curtains drawn, hoping to remain unnoticed. That night, the sounds returned. The thudding, the dragging, the rustling. This time it was closer, much closer. I could hear the leaves crunching beneath something heavy, something that wasn't trying to be stealthy. I was sure that someone was out there. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight again. But before I could open the door, I heard something else. A soft knock, barely audible, but unmistakable, came from the side of the cabin. I froze. The knock came again, followed by a low scraping sound, like something or someone was trying to open a window. I didn't move. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but none of them made any sense. What would anyone be doing out here in the middle of nowhere at night? I felt trapped. There was no phone signal, no one around for miles. The only thing I had was a small kitchen knife, and that did little to ease the growing panic in my chest. I stayed as quiet as I could, praying whatever was out there would leave. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a scratching sound on the door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It sounded like nails scraping the wood, slow and deliberate. And then, it stopped. The silence was suffocating. I sat in the dark, listening, my body rigid with fear. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing happened. The noises had stopped, and I didn't hear anything else. It was as if the world outside had gone completely still. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until the early hours of the morning to gather the courage to leave the cabin. I didn't care if I looked foolish. I was done. I grabbed my things, left the cabin, and walked back down the dirt road, my heart still pounding in my chest. As I reached the edge of the woods, I looked back one last time. The cabin stood in the distance, dark and silent. For a moment it looked normal, but I knew better. Whatever had happened out there, whatever had been watching me, wasn't something I could explain. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know what happened that night, but I knew one thing for sure. Some things are better left unexplained. It was early September when I decided to head out to the cabin. I had been planning this trip for weeks, ever since I found a small, secluded cabin online. It seemed perfect, just far enough from the city, isolated enough to feel like I could truly escape. The plan was simple. Get there, spend the weekend in peace, and disconnect from everything for a few days. No calls, no emails, no distractions. Just me, nature, and a cabin in the woods. The drive was long, a couple of hours out into the hills. The roads got narrower as I went, and the trees thicker. It was beautiful, honestly, the kind of place people talk about when they imagine getting away from it all. I turned off the main road, following a dirt path that eventually led to the cabin. The place looked exactly like it did in the pictures. Small, weathered, with a worn-down porch and a chimney sticking out of the roof. I grabbed my things from the car and made my way inside. The air smelled fresh, piney, and damp, and it had that old wooden cabin scent that felt both comforting and a little eerie. Inside, it was cozy, furnishing simple, nothing extravagant, just enough to make it feel like home. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, a couple of chairs by the fire, and a bed with thick blankets. I started a fire to warm up the place and settled in. The sun was starting to set, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. It was quiet here, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made you realize how much noise you're used to in the city. I made a quick dinner, enjoying the solitude. Afterward, I grabbed a book from my bag and sat by the fire, reading. As night fell, I decided to go outside for a walk. The stars were clearer here than anywhere I'd seen before. The sky stretched on forever, the light from the fire behind me casting a faint glow that barely reached the edges of the trees. It felt like I was the only person in the world. It was peaceful, but there was an unsettling feeling, too. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a quiet sense that something wasn't quite right. But I shrugged it off. It was probably just the isolation getting to me. I went back inside after a while and locked the door behind me. The next day, I woke up to the sound of birds. There was something about waking up in a cabin in the woods, something grounding. I had breakfast, checked the place out a bit more, and explored the surrounding area. The cabin sat at the edge of a forest, with a small stream running nearby. The trees here were thick and tall, and the air was cool and crisp. That afternoon, I decided to hike a bit further into the woods. The trail was narrow, and the further I went, the more isolated I felt. There was no sign of other people, no roads or buildings in sight. The quiet was deafening. After about an hour of walking, I stopped to take a break, leaning against a tree. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant rush of water. It was then that I noticed something odd. About 50 yards away, hidden by a cluster of trees, was a small shack. It wasn't marked on any map, and it certainly wasn't part of the property I had rented. It looked abandoned, with a roof that sagged under years of neglect. Curious, I made my way toward it. As I got closer, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with my hand, and it creaked loudly, sending a chill up my spine. Inside, it was dark, and the air smelled musty. There wasn't much in there, just some old, broken furniture, a few scattered tools, and what looked like an old barrel in the corner. But as I stepped closer to the barrel, something caught my eye. A piece of paper, crumpled and partially buried under some debris. I reached down and picked it up, unfolding it carefully. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and written in a shaky hand. It was a list of names, nothing else. Just names in no particular order. A chill ran down my back as I stared at it. It didn't seem important, but the fact that it was here in this forgotten shack gave me an uneasy feeling. I didn't want to hang around too long, so I made my way back to the cabin, trying to shake off the feeling that something was off. The rest of the day was uneventful. I made dinner, read some more, and eventually went to bed. That night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to pull me out of my sleep. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. A faint tapping sound, almost like something hitting the wood of the cabin. I got up, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping stopped as soon as I moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. I checked all the windows, but they were locked, and the place seemed quiet again. I tried to go back to sleep, but it was hard. Every creak and crack of the cabin seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. The tapping never came back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided I would leave. Maybe it was just nerves, but I felt like I had overstayed my welcome. I packed up my things and went outside to load the car, trying to put the eerie feeling out of my mind. As I was putting the last of my bags in the trunk, I noticed something strange. A footprint. It was big, a deep imprint in the soft dirt near the front steps. But I hadn't seen it when I arrived, and I hadn't seen anyone out here in days. The print was fresh, like it had been made recently. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I didn't know what to make of it. I hadn't heard any other cars, and there had been no signs of other people around the cabin. I quickly finished packing the car, not wanting to be outside any longer than necessary. I drove off, not looking back. The cabin, with its unsettling quiet and strange footprint, stayed behind me as I made my way back down the dirt path, out of the woods and toward the main road. The further I drove, the lighter I felt, the weight of that cabin and its mysteries finally lifting. It wasn't until I got back to the city and went through my things that I remembered the list of names from the shack. I had shoved it into my backpack without thinking much of it at the time, but now, looking at it, I wondered if it meant something. I couldn't remember seeing any of the names before, but something about them seemed familiar. I set it aside, not sure if I wanted to dig any deeper. But the weird thing was, as I was about to throw the paper away, I saw something written on the back, faintly in pencil. It was hard to make out at first, but eventually, I could read it. If you're reading this, you're next. I didn't know who had written it or why it was there, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back to that cabin. The weird feeling, the footprints, the strange list, it was enough. I realized then that sometimes it's better to leave things alone, not to ask too many questions. The cabin in the woods, with its secrets and its eerie quiet, would stay a mystery. I had been planning this trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, just me and the cabin in the woods, far away from the noise and stress of everyday life. I had rented a small, isolated cabin in a remote part of the forest. No cell service, no distractions. Just the trees, the sound of the wind, and a few days of quiet reflection. It seemed perfect. When I arrived, the place looked even more secluded than I had imagined. The gravel road that led to the cabin was winding, barely wide enough for my car. Trees stretched on either side, their thick branches intertwining above to block out the sun. I could feel the weight of the quiet pressing down on me, but in a good way. The kind of quiet that made you feel small but also at peace. The cabin itself was small but cozy. It was made of logs, weathered and worn by time, but still standing strong. There was a porch with a few rocking chairs and a stone fireplace on the inside. The place smelled like wood and old leather, a comforting, earthy scent. It was everything I had hoped for until I stepped inside. The floor creaked under my feet as I walked through the front door. The air inside was cool, almost too cool for a spring afternoon. The only light came from the small windows, dim and hazy from years of dust and dirt. I dropped my bag on the bed in the corner and went to the kitchen to start a fire. The stove was a bit rusty, but it worked fine. I didn't mind the imperfections. After all, this was supposed to be a rustic, peaceful retreat. I spent the next few hours settling in. I made some dinner, enjoyed the solitude, and listened to the sounds of the forest outside. The birds, the rustling leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig. It was all so calming. There were no cars, no people, just nature. That night, as I sat in front of the fireplace, I felt something shift. It wasn't much, just a slight change in the air, a subtle discomfort that I couldn't quite place. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I had been in the cabin for hours, after all. It wasn't unusual for my mind to start playing tricks when I was alone for too long. But then I heard it, a sound coming from outside. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was something else, something deliberate. A soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path leading up to the cabin. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I thought I might be imagining it. I stood up, walked to the window, and peered out. Nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe the wind had caused something to move outside. But then it happened again. Another crunch of gravel, this time closer. I moved away from the window, my breath catching in my chest. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but there was no service. My second instinct was to lock the door, but I wasn't sure if that would do any good. Who would be out there? Who could be out there this far from town? I stayed in the cabin, listening intently. The sound stopped, but the unease lingered. For the next hour, I tried to distract myself, reading a book by the fire, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But the silence was oppressive. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. It was a knock on the door. 3 sharp raps, quick and urgent. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. There was no way anyone should be out here this time of night. The cabin was isolated. The only road in was barely a dirt path, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I didn't know what to do. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound on the wood. I wanted to open the door and see who it was, but something in me told me not to. There was an instinctive dread building in my gut, telling me to stay inside, to keep the door shut and locked. I moved quietly through the cabin, looking for something, anything, that might help me feel safe. There was a heavy iron skillet in the kitchen. I grabbed it and held it close, the cold metal reassuring in my hands. I went back to the window and peeked outside again, my heart racing. There was still no one there, but the night felt different now. The woods seemed darker, more oppressive, like they were closing in on me. I don't know how long I stood there, watching, waiting. Time felt distorted, as if the hours were stretching into infinity. Eventually, the sound stopped. The air seemed to return to normal, and for a brief moment, I thought I had imagined the whole thing. But the feeling of being watched never went away. I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the cabin felt like a warning. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was awake to the sound of the front door swinging open. I shot out of bed, heart racing again, and grabbed the skillet. The door was wide open, and the cold night air was rushing in. My first thought was that maybe I had forgotten to lock it, but I knew I hadn't. The latch had been secure when I went to bed. I moved to the door and peered outside. This time, I didn't just look around the cabin. I looked out into the woods. The trees were black silhouettes against the starless sky, and the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been. It was too quiet now. I couldn't hear the wind or the animals anymore. Just silence. I closed the door quickly, locking it again. I knew I couldn't stay there another night. Something was wrong. Something wasn't right about that cabin, about the woods surrounding it. Maybe it was just my nerves, or maybe I had been alone too long, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. The next morning, I packed up my things in a hurry. I didn't bother with breakfast or checking out properly. I just wanted to leave. As I drove down the gravel road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing, just the road, the trees, and the weight of the silence behind me. When I finally reached the main road and had cell service again, I felt a strange sense of relief. But that nagging feeling didn't go away. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the sense that something had been watching me, waiting for me to leave, that the forest itself had somehow known I wasn't meant to be there. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe there was something more to it. But I'll never forget that feeling. The feeling that the woods had eyes, and they were on me the whole time. And when I think back on it, I'm just glad I left when I did. I don't know what might have happened if I had stayed another night. It was late in the evening when I arrived at the cabin. I had rented it from an old family friend, someone who had promised it was peaceful, tucked away in the woods with a perfect view of the mountains. I was looking forward to getting away from the noise of the city, spending a few days alone to clear my mind. The trip was supposed to be simple. No distractions, no people, just me, the forest, and my thoughts. The cabin was small but sturdy, built from rough-hewn logs that gave it a rustic charm. It looked exactly as I had imagined it would, and I was immediately drawn to the stone fireplace in the living room. The kind of fireplace that promised warmth on cold nights, and it would be perfect for reading or writing or just staring into the flames as the world outside grew darker. I unloaded my bags from the car and settled inside. The silence in the cabin was almost oppressive at first. No cars, no voices, not even the distant hum of electricity. Just the occasional crackling of the fire as I got the logs burning. I was familiar with the isolation. Having grown up in a quiet town, I was used to being alone with my thoughts. But this was different. The quiet here was complete. The first night passed uneventfully. I spent the evening by the fire, cooked a simple meal, and read a book until I fell asleep. The bed in the cabin was comfortable, and I slept deeply without a single disturbance. In the morning, I woke to the sound of birds outside the window and the smell of pine in the air. I stretched, got up, and decided to go for a walk around the property. The cabin was surrounded by trees on all sides, tall pines and thick underbrush. There was a narrow trail leading from the front porch that wound its way down through the woods. It was beautiful, serene, and as I walked, I could feel the stress of the city gradually slipping away. The air was cool and crisp, and every so often, a breeze would send a rustling sound through the leaves. I walked for a couple of hours, lost in my own thoughts, before heading back to the cabin. As I reached the front door, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it when I left. Maybe I had been too tired last night and hadn't secured it properly. I shrugged it off, stepped inside, and locked the door behind me. The rest of the day was uneventful. I spent the afternoon reading and lounging by the fire, enjoying the simple peace of being alone. But as night fell, something felt off. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but as the darkness crept in, I felt like I was being watched. I tried to dismiss it as just my imagination, the result of too much silence and too much isolation, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I went to bed, pulled the covers up tightly, and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt an odd sensation, like someone was standing just outside my door, waiting. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just the unfamiliar surroundings playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, I woke up early, determined to shake off the unease I had felt the night before. I made myself a hearty breakfast and decided to take a longer walk, deeper into the forest this time. I thought a hike would help clear my head. The sun was high in the sky when I started, and the trail was easy to follow, winding through the trees and up a small hill. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt, and I found that strange sense of being watched creeping in again. It was as if the trees themselves were closing in around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to push it aside and keep walking, but it kept lingering. I tried to focus on the beauty of the forest, the way the light filtered through the canopy, the smell of the earth, the distant calls of animals, but every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was never anyone. The trail was deserted, as it should have been. By the time I returned to the cabin, I was feeling more than a little on edge. The sun was beginning to set, and the shadows in the woods were growing longer, stretching out like fingers reaching for the cabin. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me, but the strange feeling lingered. I kept expecting to hear a knock at the door or a sound from the woods, but nothing came. That night, as I lay in bed, I was unable to shake the anxiety gnawing at my chest. I kept telling myself that it was just the solitude, that it was normal to feel uneasy when surrounded by so much quiet, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. It wasn't just my imagination. There was something wrong, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard it, a soft scratching sound, faint but persistent, coming from the direction of the window. It was almost as if something or someone was dragging their fingers along the glass. My heart started to race, and I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. I sat there in the dark for what felt like an eternity, my breath shallow, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing came. I must have imagined it, I thought. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal outside. I lay back down, pulling the covers up tightly around me, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I was shaken, but I tried not to show it. I made breakfast, packed a small bag, and decided to head out once more. The air was cooler than it had been the day before, and the sky was overcast with dark clouds hanging low over the mountains. There was a storm coming, and I didn't want to be stuck in the cabin if it hit. The thought of spending another night there, alone with my thoughts, was enough to make me uneasy. As I walked down the trail again, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, following me. But the woods were still and silent, as they had been before. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I walked for hours, deep into the forest, hoping that the exercise would clear my mind. But as the storm clouds grew darker, I decided to head back. The last thing I wanted was to be caught in a downpour in the middle of nowhere. When I arrived back at the cabin, I found the door ajar again. This time, I was certain I had locked it when I left. I froze, staring at the door, my heart racing. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, but there was no one around. No sign of anyone who could have opened it. I stepped inside, cautiously, and immediately noticed something was different. The air felt thicker, heavier, and the familiar quiet of the cabin seemed more oppressive than before. I checked the windows, the back door, and everything seemed secure. But the feeling of being watched had intensified. It was as if something or someone was hiding just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I spent the rest of the day pacing the cabin, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the sense of unease continued to grow. I knew that I had to leave. I couldn't stay there any longer, not with the door opening on its own and the strange feeling of being watched. I packed my things, grabbed my keys, and decided to leave immediately. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a sound coming from the woods outside, a crackling noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone was out there. I froze, my heart in my throat. For a moment, I considered running, but I knew I couldn't leave until I was sure. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way to the front door. The storm was picking up, the wind howling through the trees, and the rain was starting to fall in sheets. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight into the darkness, but there was no one there. The woods were silent once again. But just as I turned to go back inside, I saw something out of the corner of my eye movement, a shadow darting between the trees, just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam. I turned and ran, as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the car, threw my bags in the back seat, and sped off down the narrow, winding road, away from the cabin, away from whatever it was that had been watching me. As I drove, the rain came down harder, and the storm raged on behind me. But for the first time in days, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The quiet of the cabin, the strange noises, the feeling of being watched. It was all behind me now. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew that whatever had been in that cabin was never going to follow me again. The further I drove, the more I realized that I would never forget that feeling. The feeling of being completely alone in the world, yet knowing that something was out there, something I couldn't see, but that I could never escape. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a break from everything, just me and the cabin in the middle of nowhere. I was sick of the noise, the constant buzz of emails, phone calls, and social media. I needed peace, silence, and a chance to get away from it all. The cabin was tucked away in the mountains, hours away from the nearest town, accessible only by a gravel road that twisted and turned through dense woods. The kind of place you only find if you're really looking for it. When I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was just beginning to set, casting a soft orange light over the landscape. The cabin was small, but solid-looking, built from weathered logs that had clearly withstood the test of time. There was a small porch with a couple of chairs and a table, and beyond that, the trees stretched out as far as I could see. There was no sign of anyone else around. It was exactly what I wanted: peaceful, secluded, and utterly quiet. I grabbed my bag and went inside. The air smelled like pine and wood, and the place had an old, lived-in feel to it. The furniture was simple but functional. A small kitchen with a stove, a fridge, and a table with chairs. The living room had a few chairs, a couch, and a stone fireplace. There was a wooden staircase that led up to a loft where the bedroom was. It wasn't luxurious, but it had everything I needed, and it was clean. I set my bag down, took a deep breath, and exhaled, feeling the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. I decided to head outside and explore a little before it got dark. The forest around the cabin was dense, with towering trees and underbrush that made the area feel alive. The ground was soft with layers of fallen pine needles, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and vegetation. I walked for a while, taking in the peace of it all. There was no noise, no sign of any other human presence. It felt like I had stepped into a world untouched by time. As I wandered deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd. There was an old trail, barely visible under the thick carpet of leaves and moss, but still noticeable if you knew where to look. It wasn't marked on any map I had seen, but it seemed to lead somewhere. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the trail, my boots crunching softly on the ground. The further I went, the more overgrown the trail became, but it was still passable. Eventually, the trail opened up into a small clearing, and there in the center was an old structure, an abandoned shack. It was falling apart, the wood rotting and the roof sagging. The windows were broken, and the door hung off its hinges. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. There was something unsettling about it, but I couldn't quite place why. I stood there for a moment, just staring at it, before I decided to leave. There was something about that place that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, so I turned around and made my way back to the cabin. That night, after dinner, I sat outside on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring into the dark forest. The night was thick with the sounds of nature, the wind rustling in the trees, the distant call of an owl, the occasional crack of a branch. I had almost forgotten how quiet it could be out here. No cars, no people, no distractions, just nature. But as I sat there, I started to feel watched. I couldn't explain it. It was like something was out there, in the dark, keeping an eye on me. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, the isolation starting to get to my head. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I stood up, went inside, and locked the door behind me, just in case. The night passed uneventfully. I slept soundly, or at least I thought I did. I woke up early the next morning, feeling a bit disoriented. The sunlight was already streaming through the windows, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. I stretched and got up, feeling the usual aches from sleeping in an unfamiliar bed. I grabbed some breakfast, then decided to head out for another walk. This time, I didn't stray too far. I kept to the area around the cabin, walking the perimeter to take in the surroundings. Everything was still. The trees, the ground, the sky. It was all exactly the same as it had been yesterday. But then, I noticed something strange. There, just beyond the edge of the clearing near the cabin, was something half buried in the dirt. A rusted metal object, long forgotten and hidden under a pile of leaves. I bent down to get a closer look, brushing aside the leaves and dirt. It was an old, broken piece of equipment, maybe a tool, something that had been left behind years ago. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but it only added to the feeling that this place held more secrets than it let on. Still, I shrugged it off and went back inside. The rest of the day was uneventful. I spent most of it reading, occasionally going outside to sit on the porch and enjoy the view. But as the sun started to set again, that same feeling of being watched returned. This time, it was even stronger. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows, even though I knew it was just the isolation messing with my head. Later that night, I heard something. A noise. It was faint at first, like something tapping against the side of the cabin. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The sound continued. Soft, rhythmic, almost like footsteps, or something heavier brushing against the walls. I got up, my heart pounding in my chest, and went to the window. The outside was shrouded in darkness, the trees swaying gently in the wind. There was no movement, nothing out of the ordinary. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, unable to shake the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. I didn't know what it was, but I had to get out of there. I made a plan to leave first thing in the morning. The next morning, I packed my things quickly, trying to keep calm. As I was loading my bags into the car, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the dirt, leading up to the porch and disappearing into the woods. They were large, deep impressions like someone or something had been standing there, just outside the cabin, watching me. I felt my stomach drop. There was no way anyone else was out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen a single car on the road since I arrived. Still, the footprints were unmistakable. I didn't waste any more time. I jumped into my car, slammed the door shut, and sped off down the gravel road, my tires kicking up dust behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the cabin, the woods, or the strange footprints. All I wanted was to be as far away from that place as possible. By the time I reached the main road, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The woods were behind me, and I was heading back to civilization. I took a deep breath and glanced in the rearview mirror. The road stretched out ahead of me, quiet and empty, and I had no intention of ever returning to that cabin. I never found out who or what had been watching me that weekend. The footprints never made sense, but I've come to terms with the fact that some things are better left unexplained. What matters is that I got out of there. I left the cabin behind, and with it, whatever strange force seemed to haunt it. That place, the cabin in the woods, remains a mystery to me. I'll never know the full story, but I know one thing for sure. Sometimes, it's better to leave the past undisturbed. I can only hope whoever or whatever was out there never follows me again. I was exhausted when I pulled up to the cabin. The winding road had been narrow and winding, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to close in on me with every turn. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I had rented the cabin for a few days, hoping for some peace and solitude. It had been a rough few months. Work stress, personal issues, and I thought a little getaway to the middle of nowhere would help clear my head. The cabin wasn't much. It looked like something out of an old-timey movie, with weathered logs and a stone chimney puffing a small amount of smoke into the sky. It sat alone, surrounded by dense trees that seemed like they were standing guard around it. I parked my car, got out, and stretched my legs, feeling the tightness from the long drive. The air was crisp, cool for early autumn, and the smell of pine filled my nose. It was peaceful, that's for sure. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves in the wind, and I took a deep breath, hoping to let go of all the stress that had been weighing on me. The cabin door was old and creaked when I opened it. Inside, there was a wood stove on one side, a small kitchen area with an old-fashioned stove, and a couple of chairs set around a small wooden table. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, but it had a certain charm to it. A large window on one side of the room looked out over a small clearing in the woods, and I could see a trail leading deeper into the forest. There were 2 bedrooms, one at the back of the cabin, the other just off the main room. I didn't waste any time unloading my things. The quicker I got settled, the quicker I could start unwinding. I made my way to the bedroom near the back, threw my bag on the bed, and unpacked my things. A part of me felt a little uneasy. Maybe it was just the isolation, maybe it was because I wasn't used to being so far from civilization, but I shrugged it off. I wasn't here to be scared. I was here to relax. After a quick snack, I decided to take a walk. The woods around the cabin were beautiful, and I wanted to see if I could find the trail I had spotted earlier. I grabbed my jacket, tied my boots tight, and stepped outside. The air was colder now, the sun almost gone, and the woods felt even quieter. No birds, no animals scurrying through the underbrush, just the sound of my footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. I followed the trail for a while, my breath coming out in little clouds in the chilly air. The further I walked, the thicker the trees seemed to grow. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone, but when I checked my phone, I saw that I had no signal. That wasn't unusual, but I'd left my charger at home, so my phone was already low on battery. That was a little annoying, but it wasn't like I planned on needing it. I turned around and began making my way back to the cabin. As I walked, I started to feel a sense of discomfort settling in. It wasn't anything specific, just the growing realization that I was alone out here, far from help, with no one around for miles. The thought of being isolated in the woods like this made my chest tighten a little, quickened my pace. When I reached the cabin, the sky had grown dark, the light of day slipping away. I had planned on making a fire, but something felt off. The cabin seemed darker than it should have been, even though the sun had just set. The shadows inside the room stretched long and deep, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd left a window open, but I hadn't. I shut the door behind me and turned the lock, though it felt unnecessary. It was just me. I tried to shake the unease, so I made myself a warm meal on the stove and settled down in front of the fireplace. The crackling of the logs in the fire helped ease my nerves, and I was soon lost in the simplicity of the moment. After eating, I cleaned up the dishes and sat in the armchair near the fire, reading a book by the light of the flames. Time passed slowly, and I found myself yawning, my eyelids heavy. Before I went to bed, I decided to check the windows one more time. I drew the curtains closed, locked them, and checked the back door. Everything seemed fine, but there was something strange about the silence now. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of being in the woods. It was a heavy, suffocating kind of silence, the kind that made every creak and groan of the cabin sound amplified. I shrugged it off again, told myself I was being paranoid, Maybe it was just the unfamiliar surroundings getting to me. I went to bed and pulled the covers up tight, hoping sleep would come easily. But it didn't. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, disoriented and sweating. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't figure out why. The room was dark, but I could make out the vague shapes of the furniture. The fire had burned out hours ago, and I could hear the wind howling outside. I tried to calm myself, but there was this feeling of dread creeping over me. The silence was back, thicker than before. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling. The floorboards creaked occasionally, and I wondered if it was just the wind pushing against the walls. But it felt different. It felt like something was out there, something was watching. The more I tried to ignore it, the more the feeling grew. I finally got up, grabbed my jacket, and stepped into the living room. There was no explanation for it, but I felt safer in the main room, even though it was just as dark and just as cold. I made sure all the doors and windows were locked, checked the kitchen, and even looked out the back door. There was nothing out there but trees and darkness. Still, the unease wouldn't go away. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe it was the unknown of being out here all alone. It was a new experience, and sometimes our minds can play tricks when we're out of our element. So I decided to stay up for a while, just to make sure nothing was out of the ordinary. I sat on the couch, watching the moonlight filter through the windows. The silence had a weight to it, but I kept telling myself it was just the woods. I eventually dozed off, only to wake up again, this time to a sound. A soft tap, like someone gently knocking on the door. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest. Who would be out here in the middle of the night? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen a soul since I arrived. The knock came again, louder this time. I didn't move. My mind raced, but no logical explanation came to me. I slowly crept toward the door, peering through the peephole, but there was no one there. The moonlight illuminated the empty porch. Nothing but shadows. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my racing thoughts. It had to be an animal, I told myself. A raccoon or something, tapping against the door. That was the most reasonable explanation. But then I heard it again. A scrape, like something dragging along the wood. And then silence. I backed away from the door, my breath shaky. What in the world was going on? My mind spun in circles, coming up with every possibility, but none of them made sense. I decided to stay inside for the rest of the night, locking every door and window again. I didn't sleep. Every noise, every creak of the wood made my heart jump. The wind howled outside, but nothing felt right. By morning, the light of the sun creeping through the windows, I was exhausted. But as I stood up, ready to leave the cabin behind, I noticed something strange. The door wasn't locked. I was sure I had locked it the night before, but now it was ajar, just a crack. My stomach dropped. I didn't stay to investigate any further. I packed up my things quickly, grabbed my keys, and rushed out of the cabin. I didn't look back. The drive home felt long, but as I pulled back into the familiar streets of my town, I breathed a sigh of relief. I was glad to be away from that cabin, glad to be back where I could hear people, cars, and the hum of the world, and I never went back to that cabin. I was never one for nature. I'm a city person through and through, used to the noise, the people, the constant movement of the urban life. So, when my friend suggested a weekend getaway to a cabin in the woods, I wasn't exactly thrilled. But I went partly out of curiosity and partly because I didn't want to seem like a coward. He promised it would be peaceful, relaxing, a perfect escape from the chaos of daily life, the kind of thing that would help me unwind. The cabin was secluded, tucked away in a remote part of the forest, far from any towns or civilization. As soon as we arrived, I felt the silence of the place settle over me. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the ground was soft underfoot, the earth damp from the morning dew. The cabin itself was old, but sturdy, built with rough-hewn logs, the kind that made you think of a simpler time. The kind of cabin you see in movies when people go to escape and reconnect with nature. First, everything seemed fine. We unloaded our bags, and I was impressed by the view from the porch. A small stream ran nearby, and the mountains loomed in the distance, the trees thick and dark, almost like they were closing in on the cabin. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of birds, the rustle of the wind in the trees, and the steady murmur of the stream. My friend, Tom, immediately began making us dinner. I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. It was peaceful. But then, as night fell and the light began to fade, the silence grew heavier. The temperature dropped, and an unsettling chill started to creep into the air. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, but it didn't help much. We ate dinner, a simple meal of pasta and salad, and afterwards we decided to sit inside by the fire. The inside of the cabin was warm, cozy even. A large stone fireplace took up one wall, and the flames flickered and danced, casting long, eerie shadows around the room. The furniture was old but comfortable enough. An overstuffed couch, a few chairs, a coffee table, and a small wooden dining table. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, nothing that connected you to the outside world. Just the fire, the occasional creak of the cabin's wooden structure, and the sound of the wind outside. We spent the evening talking, or rather, Tom talked. I wasn't much of a talker, especially when it came to deep, philosophical conversations about life. I preferred the quiet, but Tom was persistent, asking questions, going on about his theories about life, the universe, and everything in between. I just nodded along, my attention drifting, my mind on other things. Every now and then, I would glance out the small windows, my eyes lingering on the dark shape of the forest beyond. As the night wore on, the wind picked up. The trees outside groaned in protest, their branches scraping against the cabin. It was a strange sound, not quite like anything I'd heard before. I tried to push it aside, but a gnawing feeling began to take root in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. Around midnight, Tom decided to go to bed. I didn't want to sleep yet. I wasn't tired, not in the slightest, but I figured I should at least make an effort to relax. So I stayed up, staring into the fire. The shadows in the cabin seemed to grow longer, darker, stretching across the floor and walls like they were alive. The crackling of the fire grew louder, almost deafening, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard a sound coming from the back of the cabin, like something shifting, scraping against the floor. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just the house settling the way old houses do. But it wasn't the first time I'd heard something like it. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. A shuffling sound, as if someone was moving around the cabin. I got up from my seat and made my way through the cabin, checking the windows and doors to make sure everything was locked. The cabin was solid, nothing out of place. The feeling didn't go away, though. It lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. I tried to push it out of my mind, but sleep wouldn't come. I couldn't get comfortable. My body was tense, my senses alert. The sound of the wind outside had become a constant whoosh, a reminder that we were alone, far away from any help if something went wrong. The fire had died down, and the room grew colder. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the back of the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, unsure of what to do. The sound echoed through the cabin, the sharp, sudden noise shattering the silence. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed toward the source, my feet moving faster than my mind could catch up. I reached the back of the cabin, my breath shallow, my heart racing. I swept the flashlight beam over the room, scanning every corner. The beam landed on the kitchen, where the door to the back porch had been knocked open. I could see the door swaying in the wind, the wooden frame creaking with every gust. I stepped forward, cautious, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I checked the porch outside but found nothing. The night air was cold and sharp, biting at my skin. There was no sign of anyone. The door had simply come open, as though it had been blown by the wind, but the crash, what had caused that? I locked the door again, trying to push away the unsettling feeling that was beginning to take hold. I returned to the living room, my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The wind outside had become more aggressive, its howling creating an eerie atmosphere. I tried to distract myself, to calm my mind. I sat back down by the fire, watching the flames flicker. But the shadows, they seemed different now, larger, more ominous. I couldn't help but feel that they were closing in on me, that something was watching from the darkness. The hours passed, and the storm outside only seemed to intensify. The wind was fierce now, and the rain came down in sheets, battering against the windows. It was as if the entire forest was alive, the trees swaying violently, their branches banging against the walls of the cabin. At some point, exhaustion overcame me, and I fell into a restless sleep. But it wasn't peaceful. The sounds of the storm outside mixed with the creaks and groans of the cabin, the noise echoing in my dreams, blending into something far more sinister. I woke up with a start. My body was covered in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. The cabin was quiet now, the storm having passed. I could hear nothing but the faint sound of the wind rustling the trees outside. I glanced around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. I sat up slowly, my mind still foggy from sleep. The fire had died down to embers, casting a soft glow in the room. I looked out the window, expecting to see the usual view of the forest, but instead, something caught my eye. A shadow, darker than the night itself, moved between the trees. It was quick, barely noticeable, but it was there. I froze, watching the movement closely. My breath caught in my throat. It was as though something was lurking just beyond the trees, watching me. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the spot, my body frozen in place. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the shadow was gone. But the feeling remained. I wasn't alone. I stood up, my legs unsteady, my mind racing. I checked the cabin once more, all doors and windows locked, everything in place. There was nothing I could find that would explain what I'd seen or felt. The silence was suffocating, the kind that presses in on you, making you feel small, insignificant. Finally, as morning light began to filter through the trees, the uneasy tension in my chest began to ease. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I packed my things quickly, my hands trembling, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts I couldn't quite sort out. Tom was still asleep, oblivious to everything that had happened. I couldn't stay, not with that feeling of being watched still lingering in the air. I left without a word, not even bothering to wake him. I drove away from the cabin, down the long, winding road that led back to civilization. But the unease didn't leave. The feeling of being watched stayed with me, following me like a shadow. I've never been back to that cabin, and every time I see a secluded spot in the woods, I feel that same unease settle in the pit of my stomach, a reminder that sometimes nature has a way of reminding you that you're not always as alone as you think. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend camping trip, just a simple getaway to clear my head. I hadn't been out in the woods for a while, and the thought of being away from everything, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, seemed perfect. The kind of peace you only get when you're miles away from the hustle of city life. I packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a flashlight, a couple of knives, a first aid kit, and a lighter. That was all I thought I'd need. I arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon. The sun was shining bright, but there was a cool breeze that made the air feel fresh. The forest seemed quiet, the kind of quiet that you can only experience when you're far from civilization. I chose a spot by a small creek. It seemed perfect. The sound of the water flowing would keep me company, and the view of the trees was just breathtaking. Setting up my tent didn't take long. I'm not the most experienced camper, but I've done enough trips to know how to handle the basics. I laid everything out, unpacked my food, and got the fire pit ready. The logs were dry, and the kindling lit up quickly. The flames were small but steady, and I leaned back on a rock, watching as the fire flickered. As the sun began to set, the forest took on a different feeling. The warm light from the fire contrasted with the growing shadows, making everything feel more isolated, more remote. I thought about going for a walk, but something about the quietness made me hesitate. It was like the forest was watching me, but I shrugged off the feeling. I didn't want to be paranoid. After all, it was just a forest. I spent the evening eating and enjoying the solitude. The crackling of the fire was the only sound for miles, and I could feel myself finally relaxing. But as night crept in, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything specific at first, just a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The wind picked up a bit, rustling the leaves, and I could hear the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. Maybe it was an animal, but it didn't sound like anything I had ever heard before. It was a strange, almost deliberate sound, like something was moving around the campsite, trying to stay hidden. I figured it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, so I decided to go to bed early. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and tried to get comfortable. The air was cool, and the fabric of the tent wasn't enough to keep it from creeping in. I pulled my sleeping bag up over my head, trying to block out the chill, but sleep wasn't coming easily. Every small noise outside made me tense up. The wind, the creak, the rustling of leaves, it all seemed louder than usual, and there was that distant snapping sound again. Eventually, exhaustion won over, and I drifted off to sleep. But the peace didn't last. I woke up later to the sound of something moving outside my tent. It wasn't the wind or the usual sounds of animals. No, this was different. It was too close, too deliberate. I held my breath, listening intently. It was moving around the campsite, circling the area, but always just out of sight. My heart began to race. I reached for the flashlight next to me, but then the sound stopped. I lay there, wide awake now, trying to make sense of what was happening. My mind raced with thoughts. Could it be another camper? Maybe someone was lost or stranded. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that didn't make sense. No one else was supposed to be out here. The nearest campsite was miles away, and I had seen no other cars when I arrived. Then the silence hit. It was absolute. No more rustling leaves, no more distant snaps, just the sound of my own breathing. I stayed still, trying not to make a sound. I knew I had to wait until morning. I couldn't afford to make a wrong move, not with whatever was out there. Slowly, I let my eyes close again, forcing myself to relax, but it was impossible to fall back asleep. My mind wouldn't let me. Minutes felt like hours, and then, just when I thought I might go mad from the silence, the sound returned. But this time it was closer. I could hear the footsteps, slow and heavy, crunching over the underbrush. It was walking right around my tent. My pulse quickened. My breath caught in my throat. There was something unnerving about the way it moved, deliberate and slow, as if it knew I was inside and wanted me to know it. I grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on, and shone it through the fabric of the tent. The light barely made it through the thick material, but I swore I saw something move in the shadows, something large. I held my breath, hoping it would go away, but the footsteps didn't stop. They continued circling the tent, and I could feel the air shift, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. I don't know how long I stayed like that, terrified and waiting for whatever it was to move on. But it didn't. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent slowly, making sure not to make any noise. My heart was pounding in my chest as I crept outside, the flashlight trembling in my hands. The forest around me was dark, the trees standing like silent sentinels. The creek's gentle flow was the only sound. I scanned the area, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I didn't see anything at first. No movement, no sign of anything nearby. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was suffocating, the air thick with tension. I turned around in a slow circle, scanning the edges of the forest, the darkened shadows between the trees. Then I caught a glimpse of something, a shape, just beyond the light's reach. I froze. The shape was moving, something big and dark, but it wasn't an animal. I could tell it wasn't. It was too deliberate, too controlled. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get back to the tent and pack up as fast as I could. But I couldn't move. I just stood there, watching as the shape took a step closer. Suddenly, I heard it heavy breathing. Not mine, but something else's. It was coming from the direction of the shape, deep in the trees. My blood ran cold. That was it. I wasn't alone. In a panic, I turned and bolted toward my tent, heart hammering in my chest. I ripped open the zipper, threw myself inside, and scrambled to grab my backpack. I had to get out of there. As I was frantically trying to pack, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, quickening now, like something was chasing me. I didn't stop to look. Couldn't. I grabbed my stuff, shoved it into my pack, and sprinted out of the tent, running toward the trailhead. The darkness felt endless as I ran, my breath coming in short gasps. The only thing I could focus on was getting back to my car, which felt miles away. The sounds of footsteps behind me grew louder, but I didn't dare turn around. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I kept pushing forward. The trees blurred as I sprinted down the trail, barely able to see in the pitch-black night. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the outline of my car in the distance. The headlights seemed like a beacon in the dark. I pushed myself harder, the light growing closer with each step. I reached the car, slammed the door shut behind me, and locked it. For a long moment, I just sat there, breathing heavily, trying to calm down. As I sat there in the car, still shaking, I realized how close I had come. Whatever was out there in the woods, it hadn't been just an animal. I could still hear the faint sound of something moving in the distance, but I didn't care. I was safe, and that was all that mattered. I started the engine, pulled out of the campsite, and drove away, not looking back. The eerie feeling didn't leave me, though. I couldn't shake the sense that something had been watching me, something that knew I was there. When I got back to the nearest town, I stopped at a gas station to catch my breath and check my gear. I didn't see anything unusual, but the memory of those footsteps, the strange shape in the woods, and the heavy breathing kept replaying in my mind. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a person or something else, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never camp alone again. The night had fallen quietly, the trees whispering in the wind as I sat by the campfire, the warmth of the flames casting flickering shadows across the campsite. It was one of those rare moments when I felt completely at peace, away from the noise of everyday life. I had been planning this trip for months, the perfect escape into the wilderness. A few friends had backed out at the last minute, but I decided to go alone anyway. I wasn't scared of being out there on my own. I had been camping alone before. I liked the solitude, the quiet that only nature could offer. But I didn't know then how much that silence would weigh on me. I set up camp on a small clearing deep in the forest, a few miles off any trail. There were no other campers around, no signs of human life for miles, just the trees and the open sky above. I had everything I needed: my tent, a sleeping bag, a good stove, some food, and a water filter. I set up my camp with care, making sure everything was in order, even if I was the only one here to appreciate it. I didn't want to take any chances. This was as wild as it gets. No one else nearby to help if something went wrong. The first few hours were uneventful. I cooked some simple food, enjoyed the warmth of the fire, and watched the stars start to peek out as the sky darkened. There was something special about the stillness. It felt like the world had stopped, and for a while I could just be. I never expected that something so simple, so normal, would take such a strange turn. As the fire began to die down, I could hear the rustling of leaves in the distance. At first, I didn't think much of it. Animals are common around here, and the wind had started picking up. But then, the rustling grew louder, and it wasn't the sound of small creatures moving through the brush. This was different. The sound was heavier, more deliberate, like something larger was making its way through the forest, moving closer to my camp. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear, something harmless. But then the rustling stopped, and for a moment, everything went completely silent. I stared into the darkness, straining to hear anything, my senses heightened. The wind had died down, and all I could hear was my own breath. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that the forest around me had grown unnaturally still. No crickets, no birds, no animals. Nothing. Just the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I heard it. A twig snapped in the distance. I couldn't tell where it came from, I turned my head, scanning the shadows of the trees. There was nothing there, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing second. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack, flicked it on, and shined it around the campsite, trying to pierce the darkness. The beam of light cut through the blackness, revealing only the trees, the tent, and my small campfire, now reduced to glowing embers. For a moment, I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the isolation was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I hadn't felt this uneasy in the wild before. There was a tension in the air, a sense that I wasn't alone, and that thought started gnawing at me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just overthinking it. I got up to stoke the fire, tossing a few more logs onto the flames. As the fire grew brighter, I thought I saw something move in the distance. Just for a second, a figure tall and thin, standing motionless behind the trees. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. I wasn't sure if it was a person, an animal, or something else entirely. It didn't seem right. It didn't move like anything natural. But when I blinked, it was gone. The forest once again swallowed up everything, leaving me alone with nothing but the crackling of the fire. I decided to go inside my tent, hoping that sleep would give me some relief. Maybe I was just exhausted. The wind outside had picked up again, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. But as I lay there in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. I tried to tell myself it was just the forest. That's what it was like out here. It was natural to feel on edge. But as the hours passed, I began to wonder if I was imagining things. Was I hearing footsteps? The same heavy thud I had heard earlier? Was there someone out there, circling my camp, waiting for me to make a move? I got out of my sleeping bag and grabbed the flashlight again, stepping outside the tent. The wind had died down, and the forest was eerily silent again. I couldn't see anything, but I had this gut feeling that something was watching me, something that didn't belong. I scanned the area once more, but there was no movement, no sign of life, nothing. But as I turned to go back into the tent, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, not loud, not human. It was like a whisper, barely audible, but it came from behind me. I spun around quickly, my heart racing. But again, there was nothing. No person, no animal, just the trees swaying in the wind. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself. I was starting to lose it. But even as I said that, the unease in my gut only grew stronger. I went back into the tent, trying to force myself to relax. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it was already so late. The hike out of the forest would take hours, and I wasn't about to navigate unfamiliar terrain in the dark. Plus, I kept telling myself that nothing had happened. There was no reason to panic. I had camped out here plenty of times before. I was fine, but sleep wouldn't come. Every little noise outside, every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig sent me into a frenzy. I sat up in my tent, holding the flashlight in my trembling hands. I felt the air growing colder, and my breath fogged up in front of me. It wasn't this cold earlier. Then I heard something else, a low growl. It was distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't an animal I recognized. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct in my body screamed for me to get out of there. I had never been so scared in my life. I grabbed my backpack, shoving everything into it in a frantic hurry. I had to leave. I didn't care how far I had to go. I couldn't stay here anymore. I pushed my way out of the tent, holding my flashlight in front of me. The night felt alive with movement. I shined the light around, expecting to see something in the trees. But there was nothing. Still nothing. My mind was racing. Was I just losing it? Then, just as I was about to turn around and make a run for it, I heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps getting closer. I spun around, ready to face whatever it was, but there was nothing. The forest was silent again, as though it had never been disturbed. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed my gear and started running. The path was difficult to follow, but I didn't care. I was panicking, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stumbled through the dark, tripping over roots and rocks, not even stopping to think about where I was going. All that mattered was getting out of that forest. I didn't stop running until I hit the main trail. The feeling of relief was overwhelming. The sounds of the forest, the eerie whispers and growls were gone. I didn't care to look back. I just kept walking, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. By the time I reached the nearest town, the sun was rising. I was exhausted, but I was alive. I hadn't realized until that moment how close I had come to something I couldn't explain. Something that wasn't right. I never went back to that spot in the woods, and I don't think I ever will. Some places are meant to stay unexplored, and some experiences, no matter how strange or frightening, are best left behind, in the darkness where they belong. It was a late Friday afternoon when I decided to go camping alone. I'd been working nonstop for weeks, and the thought of escaping into the woods sounded like the perfect way to clear my head. I had everything packed: my tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, food, and a flashlight. Nothing too fancy, just enough to get me through a weekend of solitude in the forest. I wasn't far from the nearest town, but far enough to feel completely disconnected from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The trail I chose was well known but not too crowded. I'd been on it once before, years ago, with some friends. The weather was perfect, a crisp chill in the air with the promise of a clear night sky. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as I made my way down the familiar path, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots the only sound I could hear. After an hour of walking, I found a small clearing near a creek. The sound of rushing water was soothing, and I figured it would be a great spot to set up camp. I unpacked my things and set up the tent quickly. The forest around me was dense, with towering trees whose branches swayed gently in the wind. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched long, and the forest grew quieter, almost too quiet. There were no birds chirping, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the sound of the creek and the occasional breeze. As night fell, I made a small fire. The warmth was comforting against the cool night air, and I sat in front of it, roasting marshmallows and staring into the flames. The firelight flickered and danced on the trees around me, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. But it wasn't anything to be concerned about. I'd been camping plenty of times before and knew how the fire could play tricks on the mind. The hours passed slowly, and before I knew it, the stars were out in full force. I finished my meal, cleaned up the campsite, and crawled into the tent. The sleeping bag was warm, and I quickly drifted off to sleep, lulled by the sounds of the forest. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had roused me, but there was a strange sensation in the air, like something was off. The fire had long since burned out, and all I could hear now was the distant sound of the creek. For a moment, I listened carefully, straining to hear anything that might explain why I was awake. But there was nothing, just the wind whispering through the trees. I tried to go back to sleep, but it was impossible. My mind kept racing, thinking I'd heard something, though I couldn't say what. A snap of a twig? A rustle in the leaves? I wasn't sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I finally decided to get up and check it out. I unzipped the tent quietly, trying not to make too much noise. The air outside was cold, but the sky was clear, and the moonlight illuminated the clearing. I stood there for a few moments, scanning the forest around me. The shadows seemed deeper now, and the stillness was unsettling. I didn't hear any animal noises like I usually would at night. No rustling of leaves, no calls from owls or coyotes. It was dead silent. I stepped away from the tent and walked a little closer to the creek. The water was flowing smoothly, its surface reflecting the pale light of the moon. I knelt down to wash my face, the cold water sending a shock through my body. The chill helped clear my head, and I stood up, about to return to the tent, when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree-line. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a man, or at least I thought it was. He was tall, wearing dark clothes that blended into the night. I couldn't see his face, but I could make out the outline of his body. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, watching me. For a long moment, I stood perfectly still, unsure of what to do. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe he was another camper, though that didn't make much sense. There weren't any other campsites around, and if he had been on the trail, I would have heard him approach. I called out softly, my voice shaky, "Hello!" No response. I felt a wave of panic wash over me, but I tried to calm myself. He might be lost or just a hiker who had wandered off the path. But then, something felt off. The way he stood so still, like he wasn't even aware of the world around him. It felt wrong. I took a cautious step back, then another and another. Each step felt heavier than the last, my feet sinking into the soft earth beneath me. I never took my eyes off the figure, though I couldn't see him clearly enough to make out any details. Just a dark shape standing motionless in the shadows. I stumbled back to the tent, trying to keep my movements slow and quiet. Once I was inside, I zipped it up as fast as I could, my hands trembling. I sat there for a moment, my heart still racing, listening intently. The sounds of the forest seemed to return, the soft rustling of leaves, the occasional creak of branches. But I didn't hear anything that would suggest the figure had moved. I lay there, wide awake, listening for any sign that he was still out there. Every creak of the tent, every snap of a twig, sent me into a fit of anxiety. My mind kept running through different scenarios, all of them equally terrifying. What if he was just waiting out there? What if he was waiting for me to fall asleep? Hours seemed to pass, though I didn't dare check the time. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, the fear squeezing the air out of my lungs. But eventually, exhaustion took over. My eyes fluttered shut, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. The morning light broke through the trees, casting a warm glow on the campsite. I woke up with a start, disoriented and groggy. The events of the night flooded back to me, and I immediately scanned the area around me. The forest was calm now, peaceful even. No sign of the figure, but I wasn't going to take any chances. I packed up my things quickly, moving as quietly as I could, not wanting to attract any attention. By the time I was done, the sun was fully up, and the world around me seemed normal again. The creek flowed gently, birds chirped in the distance, and the air was fresh and crisp. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I hadn't imagined the figure. I knew what I had seen, but now there was no sign of him. It was as though he had never been there at all. I decided to leave the campsite. The experience had rattled me, and I didn't feel comfortable staying any longer. I made my way back down the trail, retracing my steps from the night before. The forest seemed different now, quieter, more oppressive. But eventually, I made it back to the parking lot where my car was waiting. I threw my gear in the back seat and started the engine, relieved to be leaving. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me as I left. But there was nothing, just the road stretching out before me and the forest disappearing into the distance. I couldn't explain what had happened. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. There was something in the air that night, something that I couldn't quite put into words. But in the end, I was safe, and that was what mattered most. The forest was behind me now, and I was heading home, where things were normal again. No strange figures, no eerie silence, just the world I knew and the comfort of being back in it. It was over, and for the first time since I'd set up camp, I could finally breathe again. I remember the day I set off for the camping trip like it was yesterday. The sun was high in the sky, and I felt the familiar excitement in my chest as I packed my things. It wasn't a big trip, just me, a tent, and the usual camping gear. A sleeping bag, food for a couple of days, a flashlight, some spare batteries, and my old backpack. I had chosen a spot a few hours outside of town, deep in the woods, far enough from civilization that I could enjoy the quiet, but close enough that I wouldn't feel completely isolated. I was used to being alone. I didn't mind it, The calm of nature was the perfect escape from the noise of daily life. The trail I planned to hike was a familiar one I'd done a few times before. It wasn't too difficult, but it wasn't easy either. It was the kind of hike that took you through varied terrain, rocky paths, muddy stretches, and thick forests. And after the long hike, the reward was always a small, quiet clearing near a stream where I could set up camp. That day, however, things didn't go exactly as planned. It wasn't anything too dramatic at first. The hike was as usual, nothing out of the ordinary. I made my way up the trail, the only sounds around me being the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle of animals in the trees. The weather was perfect, cool but not too cold, with a gentle breeze that made the leaves shimmer. The deeper I went into the woods, the quieter it got. And while most people might have felt uneasy about the silence, I welcomed it. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. I set up my tent by the stream, the sound of the water a calming background to my work. It took me a little longer than usual to set everything up, as I was still adjusting to the heavier gear I had brought this time. I'd planned to stay out here for a few days, so I'd brought extra food and supplies. When everything was set, I made a small fire to cook my dinner. There's something about cooking over an open flame that feels right when you're in the wild. The smell of the food, the warmth of the fire against the growing chill of the night, and the steady crackle of burning wood, it all made the day's hike feel worth it. As I ate, I looked up at the sky, the stars starting to appear as the sky turned dark. I didn't realize how much time had passed until the fire was starting to die down. The wind had picked up a little, making the branches above me sway and creak. It was just the kind of night when everything felt still and calm, yet at the same time there was this underlying tension in the air. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, but something felt off. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe it was just the isolation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to ignore it and decided to settle into my tent for the night. I had my flashlight, but the soft glow from the fire was enough for now. The wind outside continued to rustle the trees, and every now and then, a twig would snap, sending my mind racing to imagine what kind of animal might be lurking just beyond the reach of my sight. Eventually, the night grew colder, and I snuffed out the fire, leaving only the embers to slowly fade away. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, the warmth from it comforting as I tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the strange feeling from earlier. It wasn't long before I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. A twig snapped. It was sharp, loud, and too close. I froze, holding my breath. The wind hadn't made that noise. It was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. I listened carefully, straining to hear any further sounds. Nothing, just the wind, and then the distant call of an owl. But that was it. No other movement. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it again. Another snap of a twig, even closer this time. This time I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it around the tent, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. My heart pounded in my chest as I peered through the small opening of the tent. There was nothing. The shadows were thick, and the trees stood silent, as if mocking my fear. I lay back down, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I lay there for what felt like hours, wide awake, listening to every little sound, trying to make sense of it. The wind had picked up again, but it didn't help. It only made the branches creak and groan louder, distorting every little sound. Around midnight, I finally drifted off to sleep, but it was fitful, filled with dreams of shadows and whispers that didn't belong in the forest. When I woke up, it was still dark, but the first hint of dawn was creeping over the horizon. The fire was just a pile of cold ashes now, and the world outside the tent was quiet again. But the feeling didn't leave me. Something was off. I packed up my things slowly, making sure I didn't leave anything behind, then decided to hike back to the main trail. I figured a change of scenery would help clear my head. The hike back felt different. The woods, which had once been calming, now seemed imposing. Every sound, every rustle in the trees, made me tense. I told myself it was just the adrenaline from the night's weird experience, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As I walked, I found myself moving faster, trying to cover more ground. The trail felt longer than it ever had before, and every time I turned a corner, the forest seemed to close in on me. It felt like the trees were pressing in, their branches reaching out to grab me. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking just beyond the trees. But every time I turned around, there was nothing. The path began to narrow, and the forest around me grew thicker. The light had changed, and the air felt heavier. Then I heard it, footsteps, slow, steady, and deliberate. I stopped dead in my tracks, holding my breath. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to figure out where the sound was coming from. It was close, too close. I looked around, my mind racing. There was no one in sight. No one had passed me, and yet the footsteps continued. It wasn't an animal either. The rhythm of the steps was too distinct, too human. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to gather the courage to move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced myself to keep walking. The steps followed. I quickened my pace, my breathing shallow and erratic. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, there was no one there, but the sound kept following me. It was like a constant presence, a shadow that wouldn't leave. The more I walked, the more desperate I became. My mind was filled with scenarios. Maybe it was another hiker, someone who had gotten lost, or someone who was deliberately following me. The logical part of me wanted to believe that it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking it, but the fear in my chest told me otherwise. Finally, I reached the main trail, the one that led back to the parking lot. I didn't dare stop to look back. I just kept moving, faster now, until I finally reached the clearing where my car was parked. I didn't stop until I was inside, the doors locked, and the engine roaring to life. I left the woods behind me as quickly as I could, the feeling of being watched slowly fading the further I drove. When I finally made it back to the safety of my home, I thought about the strange events of that night. The footsteps, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't until I started unpacking my gear that I found something I hadn't noticed before. A single boot print, fresh in the dirt near my tent. It was huge, far too large to be my own. I never went back to that camping spot, and I never will. It was the perfect weekend for camping. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. The weather was just right, cool enough for a campfire, but not so cold that I'd need a jacket. I packed up my tent, sleeping bag, a few snacks, and of course, the essentials for a good time in the wilderness. I had chosen a spot deep in the forest, far from the usual camping grounds. It felt like the kind of place where I could just disconnect from everything and enjoy some peace and quiet. I arrived at the site in the late afternoon. The forest was dense, with towering pine trees that created a canopy above, letting only small beams of sunlight through. The ground was soft and spongy with layers of pine needles, and the air smelled fresh, like earth and pine resin. It was quiet too. No birds singing, no rustling animals. Just the sound of the wind gently moving through the trees. Setting up camp was easy. I pitched my tent quickly, making sure it was far enough from the small creek that ran nearby. It wasn't much of a creek, more like a slow-moving stream, but the sound of water would be soothing as I settled in for the night. I arranged my things inside the tent, organizing the few comforts I brought. A flashlight, my phone, which I would only use if necessary, and a book for the night. As I finished, the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the clearing. I started a small fire, its flames crackling as they danced in the cool evening air. The warmth was comforting, and I sat there, staring into the fire, not thinking about much. It was just one of those moments when everything felt right. There was a gentle breeze now and then, and the flickering of the fire made the surrounding trees look like they were alive, stretching and swaying with every gust of wind. It wasn't until later, as the night began to settle in, that I started to notice something strange. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful at first, now felt different. It was subtle, but there was an unsettling stillness in the air. The breeze had stopped. The crackling of the fire became the only sound in the entire forest. I could hear my own heartbeat, a little louder than usual, and it made me uneasy. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I took a deep breath and stared up at the stars, which were now visible through the gaps in the tree branches. It was beautiful. The sky was clear, and the stars seemed brighter than I had ever seen them. But then, just as I was about to lie back and relax, I heard something, a faint sound, a rustling. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a squirrel or a deer. The forest was full of life after all. But the sound continued. It wasn't the kind of noise that an animal would make. It was almost deliberate, like something was moving through the brush, slowly and carefully. I sat up, straining my ears, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the creek. It was hard to tell how far away it was, but it sounded close enough to make me feel uneasy. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the noise, the beam cutting through the darkness, but I saw nothing. The rustling stopped. My heart began to beat a little faster, but I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to get up and check out the area around the creek. The night was pitch black now, and I had to keep the flashlight in front of me, the beam cutting through the trees. The air had gotten colder, and a light fog began to form, clinging to the ground and making everything look even more eerie. I walked toward the creek, stepping carefully over rocks and fallen branches. The rustling sound was gone, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. When I reached the creek, I stopped and listened. Everything was quiet again. I shone my flashlight over the water, which was now moving a little faster than it had earlier. I could see the occasional fish darting in the shallows, but nothing else seemed out of place. I walked along the creek for a few minutes, my mind racing with thoughts of what it could have been. Maybe it was just an animal, I kept telling myself, but something about the way the rustling had stopped so suddenly still didn't sit right with me. I decided to head back to camp. The fire was still going, but it seemed smaller now, its warmth no longer as comforting as it had been. As I made my way back, the fog had thickened, and the trees around me seemed to grow darker and more foreboding. I quickened my pace, almost running, but the harder I tried to push through the fog, the more I felt like I was being swallowed by it. When I finally reached the clearing, I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I glanced around, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The fire crackled softly, and my tent stood just where I had left it. I felt a brief moment of relief, but that strange feeling, the one that something wasn't quite right, lingered in the back of my mind. I decided to stay awake for a little longer, just in case. The more I thought about it, the more my mind started to race. What if someone else was out here? I was deep in the forest, after all, far from any other campsites. The thought of another person, someone unfamiliar, out there in the dark was unsettling. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just nerves, but the feeling didn't go away. I sat next to the fire for hours, watching the flames flicker and crackle. The fog grew thicker, and I could barely make out the trees around me. It felt like the forest had swallowed me whole. The moon had risen higher in the sky, casting pale light through the fog, but it only added to the eerie atmosphere. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., when I finally decided to get some sleep. I doused the fire, its glowing embers flickering out as I made my way into the tent. I zipped it up, cocooning myself inside, and lay on my back, staring up at the ceiling of the tent. The air was still, the only sound the distant rush of the creek and the occasional creak of the trees in the wind. But as I lay there, trying to relax, I heard something again. A soft rustling sound, this time closer than before. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. The sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was outside the tent, moving around in the brush. I held my breath, listening closely. The rustling stopped for a moment, and then I heard a footstep, a faint crunch of leaves and twigs. I sat up quickly, my pulse racing. I could feel my chest tighten as fear started to take hold. The noise was right outside my tent now, just on the other side of the thin fabric. I grabbed my flashlight and held it tightly in my hand. I knew I needed to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help, but the fear was overwhelming. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a person, a wild animal, or something else? I stayed perfectly still, hoping that whatever it was would move away. But the rustling continued, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was out there was trying to stay quiet. I felt trapped. I didn't know what to do. The only thing I could think was to wait until morning. But that seemed impossible. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. Complete silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, holding my breath, waiting for the slightest sound. But there was nothing. It was as though the forest itself had gone dead silent. I was terrified to move, to even breathe too loudly. The fear had taken over completely, and I didn't know what to do next. After what felt like hours, the silence was broken by a single, faint sound. A distant call, like the wind, but different. It was almost calming. Slowly, cautiously, I unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The fog had lifted slightly, and the first light of dawn was beginning to break through. The trees looked normal again, not so menacing. I felt a sense of relief, though the fear still lingered. I stepped out of the tent, my legs unsteady beneath me. The campfire was long gone, just a few smoldering embers left behind. The forest was quiet, but the kind of quiet that didn't feel threatening anymore. It was just peaceful. The birds were starting to wake, and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush resumed. I took a deep breath and realized something. Whatever had happened, whatever I had heard or felt, it didn't matter now. The night was over, and the forest was once again a place of peace. I packed up my things slowly, trying to shake off the lingering tension. As I made my way back to the trail, the sun was fully up, casting a warm light over the forest. The path out was clear, and I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It was a strange night, one I wouldn't forget, but in the end, I made it through. The forest didn't swallow me, and whatever was out there never came closer. The world was still there, as calm and peaceful as it had always been. I would definitely be back, but next time I might pick a more populated site, just in case. It was the beginning of summer, and I decided to take a weekend trip into the woods. I had been feeling cooped up, surrounded by the noise of city life, and the thought of getting away to a secluded spot for a few days sounded like the perfect escape. I packed up my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a flashlight, and all the essentials, and drove out to a campground I had heard about from a friend. It was remote, nestled deep in the woods, far away from the usual tourist spots. The drive was peaceful, the kind of quiet that felt like a breath of fresh air after a long week of work. I passed by small towns, winding roads, and green fields until I reached the edge of the forest. The campground was tucked behind a thick line of trees, and the moment I turned off the main road and onto the dirt trail that led to the site, I felt like I was entering another world. The forest was dense, the canopy of leaves overhead blocking out most of the light. I could hear birds calling in the distance, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the occasional snap of twigs beneath my feet. It felt calm, serene, even, but there was a hint of something else in the air, a subtle tension that I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. When I arrived at the campground, there was no one else around. It was just me, the trees, and the quiet. The spot I chose was near a small creek that ran through the area, the sound of water trickling over rocks adding to the peaceful atmosphere. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and made a small fire. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. As I sat by the fire, roasting some marshmallows and watching the flames dance, I couldn't help but notice how isolated I felt. There were no other campers, no sounds of nearby voices or movement, just the quiet hum of nature. At first, I thought it was a good thing, a chance to be alone with my thoughts, but as the night wore on, I began to feel uneasy. It was nothing specific, just a general feeling of discomfort, as though I wasn't truly alone. The first sign that something was off came when I heard a faint noise behind me, a rustling, almost like footsteps on the leaves. I spun around, but there was nothing there. No animals, no other campers, just the darkening woods. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a squirrel or a deer, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I shook it off and went back to my fire, but I couldn't help but feel that the woods were closing in around me, like the trees themselves were watching, waiting. Night fully fell and the temperature dropped. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, the warmth a comfort against the cold air. The crackling of the fire was the only sound as I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, trying to shake the sense of unease. But the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it became. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, felt like it was directed at me. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But then I heard it again, a soft thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. It was coming from the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line. My heart skipped a beat. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears to listen. There was nothing for a few moments, then another thud. This time, I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I reached for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I peered out of the tent. I saw nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a fallen branch or something moving in the underbrush. But the longer I stayed there, the more I became convinced that whatever it wasn't natural. The sounds didn't stop. Every so often, I'd hear the faint thud again, followed by what sounded like something scraping against the ground. It was like someone or something was walking just outside the perimeter of the campsite, staying just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being paranoid. But then the noises came closer, much closer. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart racing. I couldn't sit there and wait any longer. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The night air hit me like a punch to the chest, cold and sharp. I swept the beam of light across the area, scanning the trees and the underbrush for any sign of movement. For a moment, everything was still. Then I heard the noise again. It was definitely closer now, just beyond the trees. I took a step forward, my breath shallow and quick. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct told me to run. But I had to know what was out there. I moved cautiously, keeping my flashlight trained on the ground. The forest around me was eerily quiet, the sounds of nature gone, replaced by the pounding of my heart in my ears. I reached the edge of the tree line and paused. The noise had stopped, but I could feel something in the air, a heaviness, a tension that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, like a branch snapping in two, and I whipped around, shining my light in that direction. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. Just for a split second, I thought I saw a figure, tall, thin, and dark, darting between the trees. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person, moving quickly, almost as though it didn't belong. I froze, unsure of what to do. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, eyes wide, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. And then, the sound came again, this time much closer. I turned, and there it was, a shadow in the corner of my vision, moving through the trees with impossible speed. I couldn't see its face, couldn't make out any features, but I knew whatever it was not friendly. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted back toward my tent. My breath was ragged, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder. The sound of footsteps, real human footsteps, followed me. Whoever or whatever was out there was chasing me. I reached the camp and scrambled into my tent, heart racing, hands shaking as I zipped it shut. I pressed my back against the wall of the tent, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped, but I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Minutes passed, maybe more. The world outside was silent, the only sound my racing heartbeat. Slowly, the tension in my body started to ease, though the fear still clung to me like a second skin. I kept my flashlight on, pointed at the door, ready to shine it if anything tried to get in. Eventually, I managed to calm myself enough to think, whatever had been out there, it wasn't a person. I was sure of that now, but what was it? And why had it been watching me? I didn't know, but I knew I wasn't staying another night. The next morning, I packed up my things as quickly as I could. I didn't dare go back to the creek to wash up, didn't dare linger longer than necessary. The woods felt oppressive now, like they were holding something back, something dangerous. I didn't want to find out what it was. I drove back home, heart still pounding, but I didn't feel truly safe until I was back in the familiar comfort of my apartment. I haven't been camping since. Some things are better left unexplored.